Most American soldiers who fought in the Pacific saw around 40 days of actual combat across 4 years of war. The rest of that time, more than 1,000 days, was filled with waiting, with stillness, with drills that led nowhere in particular. Every army had a phrase for it. The British called it "hurry up and wait." It described, with the flat humor of military life, the rhythm that defined the war for most of the people living through it. The sudden rush to be ready, followed by hours of nothing, sometimes days. This is a story about everything in between, about the long, quiet days that surrounded the fighting, about the ways ordinary soldiers found to keep going through the waiting, and about why those days mattered just as much as the ones filled with gunfire. Settle in, and let's begin our tonight's journey. Fact number 1. Somewhere in a training camp in the American South, in the spring of 1942, a young man from Ohio was learning how to march in formation. It was his 4th consecutive day of doing exactly that. He hadn't touched a rifle yet. He hadn't seen a map of Europe or the Pacific. What he had done was fill out forms, been given clothes that didn't quite fit, eaten food that only loosely resembled anything his mother had ever made, and stood in more lines than he'd encountered in his entire life before this. This was how the American military experience began for most people. Not with combat, but with paperwork, drills, and the long, slow process of becoming a soldier. The United States brought over 16 million men and women into uniform during the war. For most of them, the first many months were made up almost entirely of waiting. Waiting to be processed, waiting to be trained, waiting to be shipped out, waiting to be told what came next. Training camps across the country were processing hundreds of thousands of people through systems that were being built even as they ran. The army itself had been a fraction of its eventual size just 2 years before. The sheer scale of it all meant that waiting wasn't something that happened between the important moments. For most people, most of the time, the waiting simply was the experience. Fact number 2. The phrase "hurry up and wait" didn't start with the Second World War, but it found its fullest and truest expression there. It described a very specific rhythm, one that ran through military life in every theater, in every army, on every side of the conflict. It went like this: a sudden urgent order to be ready, to pack up, fall in, prepare to move immediately, and then the long hours that followed, in which absolutely nothing happened. A unit might be told to prepare to move at 6 in the morning. By 6, they'd be packed and standing ready in a field. By 9, they'd still be in that same field, with no new information. By noon, a revised order might push the movement to 4 in the afternoon. By 4, it might be postponed until the following morning. The men would unpack, eat, sleep, and form up again at first light. This wasn't failure. It wasn't incompetence. It was simply the unavoidable reality of moving large numbers of men and enormous quantities of equipment through complicated and often contested terrain. The men living inside this rhythm learned something quietly essential. They learned how to exist within uncertainty, how to stay ready without being consumed by not knowing, how to wait patiently for however long the waiting happened to take. Fact number 3. By almost every account written by soldiers during the war, the single most important event in any given day wasn't a meal, a rest period, or any entertainment the army organized. It was mail call. A letter from home could completely change the feeling of a man's day. It could reach back across 10,000 miles of ocean and remind him, in a way nothing else could, exactly what he was doing and why he was doing it. The United States coordinated with the army to deliver over 6 billion pieces of mail to soldiers overseas during the war, a task treated not as a welfare gesture, but as a direct military necessity. In 1944, the army introduced something called V-mail. Letters were photographed onto microfilm, flown across oceans, and printed out at a smaller size at the receiving end. It saved enormous amounts of valuable cargo space. Over 1 billion V-mail letters were sent during the war. Each one represented a moment in a soldier's day when the waiting became, briefly, easier to carry, when a tent or a foxhole or a bunk on a crowded transport ship connected, for the length of a letter, to a kitchen somewhere, to a front porch, a bedroom, a home that still existed exactly as he had left it, quietly waiting for him to return. Fact number 4. Think for a moment about what a soldier carried, not in his pack, but somewhere quieter and harder to put down. The face of someone he wasn't sure he would see again. The last conversation before he left, which may or may not have gone the way he'd wanted. The sound of a particular street on a summer evening. The specific weight of a favorite chair. The smell of a kitchen he'd never once thought to appreciate until it was gone. He carried all of this through training camps, across crowded ships, through staging areas in England and North Africa, and across the Pacific Islands. And the carrying was its own kind of labor. Not the kind any war poster celebrated, but the quiet, daily, invisible effort of keeping those memories alive across months and years of conditions that slowly worked to wear them away. The military understood morale. That's why mail was treated as essential, why the USO existed, why films were screened and shows organized. But no program could fully address what a soldier was really managing during the long hours of waiting. The private work of holding himself together across a distance with no clear end, in a situation he had to keep only half thinking about just to stay functional. It was real work, quiet, unrecorded, and carried entirely alone. Fact number 5. Card games were everywhere. In canvas tents in North Africa, on the mess decks of troop ships, in Quonset huts in England, in the crowded holds of landing craft waiting for dawn, American soldiers played poker, with cigarettes, with coins, with whatever could stand in for chips when nothing proper was available. British soldiers played pontoon and whist. German soldiers played skat. Japanese soldiers played hanafuda. Every army had its own card culture, its own hierarchy of favored games, its own informal understanding of how gambling worked among men who had very little to spend money on, and a rather complicated relationship with money in general. The card game served the same essential purpose wherever it appeared. It gave men something to do with their hands and their minds during hours that had no other content. It created a small temporary world where rank disappeared, and luck or skill decided outcomes. A genuine relief in an environment where rank decided nearly everything else. It passed time without requiring the kind of emotional investment that could be risky to make, and it offered, in the small contained drama of each hand, a safe and manageable version of risk, a quiet, ordinary rehearsal for the uncontrolled risk that was always waiting somewhere at the end of the next set of orders. Fact number 6. The logistics of the Second World War were among the most complex organizational achievements in all of human history, and at every level they produced waiting as a natural and unavoidable byproduct. Moving a single infantry division, 15,000 men along with their vehicles, weapons, food, ammunition and medical supplies, required a chain of calculations that stretched back thousands of miles. Before a single soldier fired a single shot, someone had to confirm the trucks were available, the roads could bear the weight, the fuel was positioned where the trucks would need it, the ammunition was compatible with the weapons it was meant to supply, and the food would arrive before the men ran out of the energy to continue. Any single gap in that chain created a delay, and delays created waiting. Historians of military logistics estimate that for every American soldier at the front, roughly 8 men were working somewhere behind him just to keep the system functioning. The combat soldier waiting for orders was waiting, in part, because the vast and intricate organism sustaining him required constant careful maintenance simply to remain in a state of readiness. This wasn't inefficiency. It was the unavoidable reality of operating at a scale no previous generation had ever attempted. The waiting was woven into the size of the enterprise itself. Fact number 7. Digging was the elemental activity of the waiting soldier, and it was rarely as purposeful as it might sound from a distance. A unit told to hold a position dug in. A unit told to advance to a new position dug in there too. When the position changed again, the old holes were left behind, and fresh ones were dug wherever the men now stood. Over the course of a single campaign, a soldier might dig dozens of foxholes, each one a small personal investment of physical effort, each one occupied for a night, a week, or sometimes just a few hours, before the next order came and the hole was left to the earth. Digging was practical, of course. A foxhole stopped shrapnel, provided cover, and gave a man a small defensible space in a landscape otherwise completely exposed. But it was also psychological. It gave men something physical and purposeful to do during hours that offered nothing else. It imposed gentle structure on unstructured time. It produced a result, a hole in the ground at the end of a stretch that might otherwise have produced nothing measurable at all. Veterans of the Italian campaign, who spent much of the winter of 1943 and 1944, dug into rain-soaked hillsides, described the smell of turned earth carrying. For decades afterward, the quiet and specific emotional feeling of a foxhole in the rain, waiting for something to happen. Fact number 8. The troopship crossing was perhaps the most complete and unavoidable form of waiting the entire war produced. Crossing the Atlantic from the United States to Britain took roughly a week. Crossing the Pacific toward the island staging areas could take 3 weeks or more. And during the entire crossing, there was genuinely nothing to do. No training the cramped conditions allowed. No way to move any faster. No ability to influence anything at all. Ships were packed far beyond their peacetime capacity. A vessel designed to carry 1,000 passengers might hold 5,000 soldiers, sleeping in bunks stacked 4 or 5 high in holds that were sweltering near the equator and bitterly cold in the North Atlantic. Seasickness was widespread on Atlantic crossings, especially in winter. Boredom was universal on every route. Men read whatever books were available, played endless cards, wrote letters they couldn't send until the ship docked, talked about where they might be headed, and spent long, quiet hours staring at the ocean from whatever space they could find on the overcrowded decks. The crossing was waiting in its purest form, complete, inescapable, with no visible end from inside it. A man was simply being carried somewhere he hadn't chosen, at a pace he couldn't change, toward a destination no one had told him clearly. All he could do was wait for the water to finally run out. Fact number 9. Most people assumed, before they entered the military, that rank and waiting had a simple and logical relationship. The higher your rank, the less you would wait. In reality, it often worked exactly the other way around. The private had nothing to plan and no decisions to make. He was told where to be and when, and his waiting was at least uncomplicated. The straightforward patience of a man carrying no particular responsibilities beyond showing up. A company commander was also waiting, but doing so while preparing plans that might be cancelled. Managing the morale of 100 men who were equally waiting, receiving and passing along orders subject to revision at any moment, and carrying the particular quiet tension of a man responsible for outcomes he couldn't fully control. The further up the chain of command, the more consuming and complex the waiting became. Generals planning large operations waited for incomplete intelligence, for supplies that hadn't arrived, for political approvals that weren't yet given, and for weather that had absolutely no interest in anyone's timeline. The famous photograph of Eisenhower speaking quietly to paratroopers on the eve of D-Day captures a man who had been waiting, in one form or another, for the largest amphibious operation in history to become possible. A waiting that had stretched across months, and carried a weight that no private standing in a field was ever required to bear. Fact number 10. The body developed its own uneasy relationship with the waiting, and it was rarely a comfortable one. Physical fitness, maintained through active training periods, quietly eroded during the long static stretches. Men in garrison conditions moved too little, ate too much, and gradually developed what military doctors of the period described as flat affect, a gentle dimming of physical energy and emotional range that was the body's reasonable response to sustained low stimulation, combined with low-level background anxiety. The military responded with compulsory physical training programs, organized sports, and work details designed to keep men physically occupied during inactive periods. Some of these were genuinely useful. Many were transparently manufactured, tasks invented to fill time rather than accomplish anything real. Men who had worked physically before the war, farmers, laborers, tradesmen, tended to find the garrison routine less psychologically difficult than those who had held quieter civilian occupations. Men accustomed to physical activity often found the lethargy of extended waiting more distressing than the danger of combat itself. The body, it turned out, was better suited to the intense demand of action than to the sustained, low-grade tension of waiting for action to arrive. The physical consequences of that mismatch, fatigue, restlessness, weight gain, and a general creeping malaise, appeared consistently across every extended garrison period, in every theater, throughout the entire war. Fact number 11. The cigarette was the unofficial currency of the waiting soldier, and its presence in the Second World War is inseparable from the particular texture of military boredom. American soldiers received cigarettes in their ration packs, up to 4 per day in certain configurations, and more could be bought cheaply through the post-exchange system, which stocked familiar American brands at subsidized prices. By 1944, the military was distributing over 400 million cigarettes every single month to its overseas forces. Cigarettes served several purposes at once in the culture of military waiting. They were currency, tradable for food, small favors, and minor comforts. They were a social ritual. Lighting one up was an unspoken invitation to conversation, a natural pause marker in an otherwise undifferentiated day. But above all, they gave the hands and mouth something to do during the long hours that had no other content. The act of smoking had a beginning, a middle, and an end. Roughly 4 minutes of purposeful physical engagement in a day that might otherwise pass as one long, featureless stretch of nothing. Military authorities understood this clearly. So did the tobacco companies, who maintained their supply chains as a quiet priority. The cigarette wasn't simply a habit during those years. It was a small, reliable structure in days that badly needed one. Fact number 12. The line between the front and the rear was never as clean as military maps made it appear. There was the forward area, where fighting was immediate, and waiting was laced with the sharp anxiety of a man who understood his next few hours might end everything. There was the rear area, where fighting was distant and waiting carried the quieter anxiety of a man who knew the front was always temporary and eventually claimed everyone passing through it. And then there was the vast middle ground, the staging areas, the supply depots, the transit camps, the rear echelon positions, where men waited in conditions that were neither safe nor immediately dangerous, but simply unresolved. The men in this middle ground occupied a psychological space the military had no precise name for. They weren't in combat, they weren't home. They existed in a kind of suspension that could stretch across weeks or months, during which nothing was required of them beyond readiness, the sustained maintenance of the capacity to act in conditions that provided no action. Veterans who described this state in later years most often reached for the word uncomfortable, which is a remarkably small word for what they were actually carrying. The experience of standing indefinitely on the edge of something serious, with no reliable information about when or whether that edge would finally give way. Fact number 13. The books soldiers chose to read during the waiting years tell their own quiet story. The Armed Services editions, small paperbacks produced in a format narrow enough to fit into a uniform pocket, were distributed to American troops from 1943 onward, eventually reaching over 120 million copies across more than 1,200 different titles. The selection committee took its work seriously, balancing popular fiction with more demanding reading, novels alongside poetry, history, and humor. What soldiers chose from that selection, and what they wrote home about reading, reveals something about how they were managing the psychological weight of the waiting. Escapist fiction was enormously popular. Westerns, thrillers, detective stories, stories that moved at pace and resolved into clarity, which was precisely the opposite of a soldier's actual situation. But serious literary fiction was also read widely, and veterans' accounts suggest that challenging, demanding books served a particular purpose for some men, a way of preserving the reflective, inner part of themselves that military routine most threatened to slowly wear away. The card game and the cigarette addressed the surface of the waiting. The books reached somewhere a little deeper, into the part of a man that needed more than distraction, that needed to think, to feel, and to remain recognizably himself across months of conditions designed, almost incidentally, to make that difficult. Fact number 14. The relationship between soldiers and weather during the waiting periods was more intimate and more exhausting than most historical accounts acknowledge. The famous battles happened in weather: the mud of Normandy, the frozen Ardennes, the monsoon rains of Burma, and historians have recorded how weather shaped the fighting. But weather also shaped the waiting, in ways the histories have largely passed over. Men waiting in static winter positions lived in a continuous, inescapable relationship with cold and wet that was demoralizing in its own distinct way, separate from the fear of combat, and in some respects harder to endure because it never paused. Trenchfoot, caused by prolonged exposure of the feet to cold and damp conditions, hospitalized more American soldiers in the European winter of 1944 than German fire did during certain periods. The military response was to issue instructions about foot hygiene and make officers personally responsible for checking their men's feet regularly, which produced the particular indignity of a sergeant carefully examining a corporal's toes in a waterlogged foxhole in Belgium. In the Pacific, soldiers waited in heat and humidity that was itself a kind of slow assault: rotting clothing, molding equipment, insects in overwhelming numbers. The weather didn't pause during the waiting. It simply continued, without any interest in anyone's circumstances, as the permanent backdrop to everything else. Fact number 15. The military understood, with varying degrees of sophistication depending on the commander, that idle soldiers represented a specific and manageable problem. Boredom produced gambling, which produced debt and resentment. It produced drinking, which produced accidents and conflict. It produced the particular kind of friction that develops between men who have shared very close quarters for months without adequate privacy or personal space, and who have exhausted the ordinary mechanisms of getting along. The American Army's Special Services Division, established in 1941, was the institutional answer to this understanding. Its specific purpose was to organize entertainment, recreation, and activities for troops not currently in active combat. By the end of the war, Special Services was running libraries, sports leagues, film screenings, theatrical productions, and music programs across every theater. The USO worked alongside it, bringing performers from civilian life, musicians, comedians, actors, to perform for troops in venues ranging from purpose-built theaters in rear areas to the backs of trucks parked in forward staging zones. Bob Hope, who became the war's most famous USO performer, described arriving at forward shows and finding men who had been waiting for weeks for almost anything to happen. What he could offer that nothing else in the military system could replicate was laughter. Specific, genuine, unperformative laughter. In the long grey waiting days, that turned out to matter more than almost anyone had predicted. Fact number 16. The waiting on secured Pacific islands had its own distinct and difficult character, different from anything soldiers experienced in Europe. Once an island had been taken, Guadalcanal, Saipan, Bougainville, any one of dozens across the central and southwestern Pacific, the men who had fought for it didn't immediately move on. They held it, maintained it, built the airfields and supply facilities the island's position required, and waited for the next operation while the environment around them quietly worked to undermine everything. The jungle generated disease at a rate that exceeded combat casualties across much of the Pacific campaign. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and various infections were constant presences in every medical record. Men who weren't ill watched the men around them become ill. The insects were relentless. The heat and humidity rotted clothing and rusted equipment. Food spoiled. Skin developed infections the body's normal defenses couldn't manage alone. And over all of it, in the stretches between operations, there was the waiting. Not the clean, purposeful waiting of a soldier who knows exactly what he is waiting for, but the formless suspension of men who had taken their island and now simply occupied it, in a jungle they hadn't chosen, until someone somewhere decided what was supposed to come next. Fact number 17. A soldier's relationship with time changed fundamentally from the moment he entered uniform, and the change accumulated quietly until it became the defining condition of his daily life. In civilian life, time was divided by personal choice: work time, leisure time, family time, sleep, the shape of the day belonged, at least in part, to the person living it. In military life, time belonged entirely to the institution. It was allocated by schedule, réveil, drill, mess, training, lights out, and a soldier's own sense of what any given hour was carried no weight whatsoever. The effect of this was subtle at first, and then increasingly consuming. Men who had once experienced time as something they managed found themselves simply inside time, subject to it, unable to shape it in any meaningful way. The waiting this produced was a particular kind of waiting, not the voluntary waiting of a man who has chosen to sit quietly somewhere, but the involuntary waiting of a man placed somewhere and told to remain until further notice. The distinction mattered deeply. Voluntary waiting can be peaceful. Involuntary waiting, especially when its duration is unknown, gradually erodes the sense of personal agency that sits at the center of adult psychological well-being. Military psychiatrists studying extended garrison life consistently noted that the loss of personal time sovereignty was among the most quietly damaging features of long service, often more damaging over time than the acute stress of combat itself. Fact number 18. The food told its own story about the waiting. K rations, the individual combat ration issued to American soldiers, were designed for short-term use in active conditions, and they were adequate for that narrow purpose. They were calorie-dense, lightweight, and shelf-stable. What they were not designed for was extended daily consumption across weeks and months, and the men who ate them for that long developed a relationship with them that ranged from resigned tolerance to something approaching genuine despair. The breakfast unit contained a canned meat product, compressed cereal biscuits, a fruit bar, sugar, instant coffee, and 4 cigarettes. The dinner unit contained canned meat or cheese, crackers, a bouillon cube, and candy. The supper unit varied, but not by much. Day after day, the same configurations, the same packaging, the same tastes. Men who had access to mess halls and field kitchens ate better, but the food was still institutional, still monotonous, still entirely disconnected from the specific tastes and smells that meals carried in ordinary life. The longing for food that tasted like something specific and remembered, something made in a real kitchen, by someone who knew what you liked, was a quiet, persistent undercurrent of the waiting years. Veterans described it decades later with an intensity that made clear it had never been simply about hunger. It had always been about home. Fact number 19. Sleep was the last true refuge of the waiting soldier, and it was one the military couldn't entirely reach or control, which gave it a specific and precious quality as a space of personal freedom. Men who were bored, anxious, cold, homesick, and uncertain about their future slept whenever the opportunity arose, and the opportunity arose more often than in civilian life, precisely because there was so little else to fill the hours. The ability to fall asleep anywhere, on bare ground, in a moving vehicle, leaning against a wall, was a skill soldiers developed quickly and described with a quiet pride that seemed out of proportion until you understood what it actually represented. Sleep was the one place the institution couldn't follow. It was escape in the most literal sense. It was also repair. The body under sustained waiting period stress needed more sleep than civilian life typically required. Military research conducted during and after the war confirmed that sleep deprivation was a meaningful contributor to the psychological deterioration seen in soldier populations during extended inactive periods. Men who slept well maintained their emotional stability more reliably than those who couldn't, and the sleep available in tents, foxholes, truck beds, and bombed-out buildings was often poor enough that the fatigue accumulated across months of broken rest added its own quiet, invisible weight to everything the waiting already carried. Fact number 20. The rumor was the unofficial information system of the waiting army, and it operated with a speed and enthusiasm that formal military communications rarely matched. In the absence of real information about what was happening and what was coming, information routinely withheld from ordinary soldiers for security reasons, rumor filled the gap with such energy that it became, in practical terms, the primary way soldiers understood their situation. Rumors fell into recognizable patterns. The optimistic rumor said the war would be over by Christmas, that the unit was rotating home, that peace talks had begun. The pessimistic rumor said the unit was being sent to the most dangerous possible theater, that casualty estimates for the next operation were catastrophic, that the rotation schedule had been suspended indefinitely. The wish fulfillment rumor described, in loving and specific detail, the rest camp supposedly being prepared, the showers, the real food, the beds with actual mattresses. None of these rumors were reliable. All of them were believed to varying degrees, because in the information vacuum of the waiting army, any account of what was happening was more bearable than the blank uncertainty the official system provided. The rumor was the waiting soldier's attempt to write the ending of a story he was stuck inside, with no access to the actual text and no way of knowing when the next chapter would arrive. Fact number 21. The friendships formed during the waiting were, by the testimony of almost every veteran who ever wrote about the war, among the most enduring and meaningful relationships of their entire lives. Not the bonds forged in crisis, the man who pulled you from danger, whose connection was intense and narrow and formed in seconds. The friendships of the waiting were something slower and more complete. They were built across hundreds of shared hours of boredom, cold meals, bad weather, card games at 2 in the morning, and conversations about home that circled the same ground again and again without ever quite exhausting it. They were built between men who would never have chosen each other in civilian life. Different cities, different backgrounds, different ways of seeing the world, but who had been placed in close proximity long enough for all the usual social performance to fall away. You cannot maintain a performance across months of shared foxholes and cold rations and sleepless nights. The person left when all the performance has been exhausted is the person the friendship is actually with. Veterans who struggled to describe what the war had meant to them frequently came back, in the end, to those friendships. Specifically to the men they had waited with. The men who had shared the long, grey, unrecorded stretches between the moments history bothered to write down. Those were the ones they remembered most. Those were the ones who stayed. Fact number 22. The staging area deserves its own consideration, because it occupied a unique and particularly difficult psychological position in the soldier's experience. A staging area was not a training camp and not a combat position. It was the place where a unit assembled and prepared for an operation that had been ordered but not yet begun. Complete readiness combined with complete inaction. The men in a staging area had been told, in general terms, what was coming. They had their equipment, they had attended briefings, in some cases they had studied maps and been shown their objectives, and then they waited. Sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, while logistics were finalized, weather was assessed, and the 1,000 interdependent pieces of a large operation were carefully brought into alignment. This waiting was qualitatively different from the unfocused boredom of ordinary garrison life. It was waiting with a specific and known object at the end of it. Waiting with a clear awareness of what would follow when it finally ended. Veterans consistently described the staging area as among the most psychologically demanding experiences of the entire war, often harder in its own way than the operation itself. It produced a particular kind of dread, not the diffuse anxiety of not knowing, but the precise, fully formed anxiety of knowing exactly what was coming and being unable to do anything at all except wait for it to arrive. Fact number 23. The soldiers who spent the waiting years guarding things are among the least celebrated figures in the entire history of the war, and they were by sheer numbers among the most numerous. Guard duty, standing watch over supply depots, prisoner enclosures, ammunition stores, headquarters buildings, airfields and perimeters, was a constant requirement that occupied vast quantities of soldier time without producing any outcome that could be recorded or celebrated. A man standing a 2-hour watch in the rain outside a supply depot in England was not doing anything that would appear in any history of the war. He was simply there, in the dark and the wet, maintaining a presence that theoretically deterred whatever the watch had been established against. The experience of guard duty during the long static periods was described by veterans with a specific and weary contempt, distinguishable from other forms of waiting because it imposed a physical requirement. Standing still, staying alert, remaining watchful, while providing even less stimulation than the passive waiting of a bunk or a card table. A man standing guard was not permitted to sit, read, or talk. He was required to be awake and watchful in conditions specifically designed to encourage neither. The military solution, rotating the watch in 2-hour blocks, addressed the fatigue without addressing the underlying pointlessness of the activity, which was something no rotation schedule could cure. Fact number 24. What soldiers actually thought about during the long hours of waiting is something the historical record approaches only indirectly, through letters written to be read by censors as well as by the people they were meant for, and through diaries kept in secret. What men actually thought, alone in a mind with nothing to occupy it, was considerably more complicated than anything they committed to paper. They thought about death, not abstractly, but in the specific, quiet, involuntary way that sustained proximity to danger produces. They thought about the people at home with an intensity that civilian life never generated, because distance and uncertainty made those people more vivid, not less. They thought about what they would do if they survived, constructing futures in extraordinary detail as a way of convincing themselves that a future was still available to be constructed. They thought about food. They thought about the specific discomforts of where they currently were. They thought about the last thing that had gone wrong. And somewhere beneath all of it, they thought about the question that the official information system never directly addressed, whether what they were doing would turn out to have been worth it. That question, unanswerable in the moment, answerable only in retrospect if at all, was the deepest thing the waiting produced. It is the thing that veterans' accounts most consistently circle around, quietly, without ever quite landing on it. Fact number 25. The Army newspaper was one of the most important institutions in the waiting soldier's daily life, and it was a considerably more honest publication than its official status might have suggested. Stars and Stripes, the American military paper published since the First World War, ran as a daily during the Second, distributed across every theater. Its editorial policy allowed a level of genuine soldier candor, letters complaining about officers, cartoons gently mocking military bureaucracy, reporting that acknowledged the unglamorous realities of garrison life that would have been unthinkable in a civilian publication of the same period. The paper's most beloved contribution to the culture of waiting was the cartoons of Bill Mauldin, whose strip featured two perpetually dirty, perpetually exhausted infantrymen called Willie and Joe. Their relationship to military authority ranged from resigned tolerance to gentle, tired mockery. Mauldin's drawings captured something no official account managed: the specific daily texture of the ordinary soldier's experience. The mud, the cold, the terrible food, the sense that officers sometimes seemed to inhabit a completely different war from the one the enlisted men were actually living. The cartoons were deeply loved by enlisted men and occasionally resented by senior officers, which was itself a precise measure of how accurately they described the gap between how the war was managed from above and how it was experienced from below. Fact number 26. Turning a civilian into a soldier took, at minimum, 13 weeks of basic training in the American Army, and often considerably longer for specialized roles. During those weeks, the recruit was being subjected to a comprehensive process of institutional reshaping that went well beyond the teaching of specific military skills. The military needed men who would follow orders under extreme stress, who would maintain unit cohesion when everything around them suggested running, and who would do this not through individual heroic resolve but through trained responses rehearsed to the point of reflex. The waiting built into training, the hours of drill, the repetitive cleaning of weapons that weren't dirty, the making and remaking of beds that would be inspected and remade again, served this deeper purpose as much as any specific skill it appeared to teach. The point of learning to make a bed with perfect corners was never really the bed. It was the training of a man to perform a precise task correctly every time, on command, without complaint. The waiting that recruits experienced during training was, in other words, itself the training. Not wasted time between lessons but the lesson itself, teaching men to exist patiently inside a system that owned their time completely, so that when the moment finally came and something specific was required of them, the habit of compliance was already deep in the body. Fact number 27. The Pacific soldier's relationship with the ocean was one of the most distinctive features of that theater's particular experience of waiting. For men deployed across the island chains, the ocean was always present, always visible, always audible, always defining the absolute outer limit of the available world. Unlike the European soldier, who was waiting in a landscape that connected, at least in theory, to places familiar or imaginable, the Pacific soldier was waiting on a piece of land surrounded in every direction by water, at the end of a supply chain stretching thousands of miles back to the nearest thing resembling home. The ocean was beautiful, veterans noted. in ways that felt almost insulting given the circumstances. Turquoise in the shallows, deep blue at distance, lit at night by phosphorescence that made anything moving through the water glow softly in the dark, and it was also the wall of an enclosure, the edge of the available world. A soldier in France could, in theory, walk to Paris. A soldier on Bougainville could walk in any direction and arrive, within an hour, at water. The ocean that had carried him to his island was the same ocean that kept him there until someone organized a ship, which would happen when someone somewhere decided what came next, which was information he did not have and could not ask for, and simply had to wait for on his island, surrounded by water, watching it glow in the dark. Fact number 28. The relationship between officers and enlisted men during the waiting periods revealed something about military social structure that combat tended to obscure. In action, rank was functional. Officers led, enlisted men followed, and the hierarchy justified itself through immediate practical necessity. In the waiting, rank became administrative and social, which changed its character entirely. Officers had separate mess facilities, separate quarters, and a different relationship to free time, not because they were doing more necessarily, but because the institution maintained the distinction regardless of what either group was actually doing, which was often very little. The social distance this created was a source of resentment in some units and a matter of genuine indifference in others, depending almost entirely on the character of individual officers and their willingness to close the gap during inactive periods. The officers who were respected during the waiting were almost invariably those who made that closing visible, who ate with their men sometimes, who joined card games across rank lines, who made the administrative work of idle periods feel like shared management rather than one-sided imposition. The officers who were not respected were those who maintained the full apparatus of rank distinction during periods when its only function was to mark social distance, which in conditions of shared boredom and shared discomfort struck enlisted men as a specific and unnecessary kind of pettiness that no amount of later combat performance could entirely erase. Fact number 29. Medical waiting was its own distinct category within the broader experience, and it has received almost no historical attention. Men who were wounded or ill waited in field hospitals, evacuation hospitals, base hospitals, and convalescent facilities for weeks or months at a time, in conditions ranging from adequate to genuinely difficult, with varying amounts of information about their recovery, their likely return to duty, and what was happening to their units in their absence. The medical waiting had its own particular emotional texture, the combination of physical pain or illness, institutional dependency, and uncertain outcome that characterizes any patient's experience, amplified by the fact that the war had placed them in the situation that produced the injury in the first place. Men recovering from wounds often described this period as harder in certain ways than what had preceded it, partly because enforced physical passivity was in direct contrast to what the body was accustomed to, and partly because the hospital provided for the first time in months an environment quiet enough to actually think. And the thoughts that filled that quiet were not always comfortable. Military psychiatrists observed that the recovery period, particularly for men who had been in sustained combat before being wounded, was frequently when the psychological costs of the war first became clearly visible. In the stillness of a hospital bed, what had been held at a manageable distance during the noise and movement of active service finally found the space to make itself felt. Fact number 30. The night watch produced a form of waiting different in kind from any other the war offered. A man on watch after midnight, in a position that had been quiet for days, in weather that was cold or wet, operating on a level of fatigue that made simple alertness an active effort rather than a natural state. This man was managing competing demands that had no civilian equivalent whatsoever. He was required to be completely alert in conditions that demanded sleep. He was required to observe carefully in conditions that offered almost nothing to observe. He was required to remain still in conditions where movement was the body's only available source of warmth. And he was doing all of this alone, in darkness, in a landscape that his mind, deprived of sufficient stimulation, was entirely free to populate with whatever threats his imagination chose to generate. Veterans described the night watch as the loneliest experience of the war. Not the most dangerous or the most demanding, the loneliest. It placed a man in conditions of complete isolation with only his own thoughts for company, for 2 or 3 hours at a stretch. in a darkness that was absolute and a silence that was itself information. Many veterans described hearing things during night watch that later proved to be nothing. Many described seeing things. The imagination, given enough darkness, enough fatigue, and enough isolation, generates its own intelligence, and it is not always reliable. Fact number 31. The sports that soldiers played during the waiting years were not casual pastimes. They were deliberate institutional responses to a specific and well-understood military problem. An army that wasn't fighting needed to stay physically fit, mentally engaged, and socially bound together. Sports addressed all three requirements simultaneously, which is why every major Allied army organized competitive sports programs with a thoroughness and resource commitment that might seem surprising until you understand what they were actually managing. The American Army ran baseball leagues, boxing tournaments, and football competitions across every theater. The British ran cricket and football, each sport carrying its own class and regional associations into the structure of military recreation. Baseball reached parts of the world it had never previously visited, played on improvised diamonds cut from jungle clearings, laid out on airfield runways, marked on beaches with whatever was at hand. Japanese soldiers watching from surrounding hills during the Guadalcanal campaign could reportedly hear the American baseball games from their positions, a demonstration, whether intentional or not, that the men on the other side of the line were comfortable and organized enough to play sport while the campaign continued. Sports gave men a reason to care about an outcome that had nothing to do with the war. In circumstances where caring about anything outside of survival was itself a form of psychological resilience that turned out to matter enormously. Fact number 32. The soldier's relationship with alcohol during the waiting years was one that military authorities managed with varying degrees of success and considerable official inconsistency. The American Army officially discouraged drinking, maintained nominal dry policies across many areas, and prosecuted men for drunkenness under military law. It also distributed beer as part of rest and recreation provisions, operated clubs that served alcohol in rear areas, and looked the other way at the informal brewing operations that appeared wherever men had sufficient time, basic ingredients, and the particular motivation that extended waiting reliably produces. The British Army had a longer and more pragmatic tradition. The daily rum tot had been a feature of British military life since the 18th century, and the relationship between soldiers and alcohol was managed with an acceptance that the American Army's nominally stricter approach could rarely match in practice. The Germans issued schnapps. The Soviets issued vodka. Every army arrived at its own version of the same calculation. The underlying logic was consistent across all of them, that a moderate and managed relationship with alcohol was preferable, in the context of extended waiting, to the complete prohibition that was the official position of several commands and the impossible ideal of several more. The men who drank were managing the waiting with the tools available to them. The institutions understood this, even when they could not say so openly. Fact number 33. Waiting for news from home, as distinct from waiting for news about the war, was one of the most psychologically demanding aspects of extended deployment, and one that the histories of the waiting experience most consistently underrepresent. A soldier deployed overseas was effectively cut off from real-time knowledge of his family's situation. Letters took weeks to arrive. The news they carried was already old by the time it reached him. Events at home that were immediate and urgent, an illness, a death, a financial difficulty, could not be communicated quickly, and when they finally were communicated, the soldier had no meaningful way to respond within any useful time frame. He could write back, knowing the reply would take weeks more. He could request emergency leave, knowing the request would move through a chain of command with its own priorities. Or he could simply carry the knowledge, unable to act on it, in a situation where carrying things without being able to act on them was already the defining condition of his days. Veterans described receiving news of deaths at home while in deployment as among the most disorienting experiences of the entire war. The grief was genuine and immediate, but the context in which it had to be managed, a tent, a foxhole, a barracks bunk, was so completely wrong for grief that the emotion had nowhere natural to go. It was folded inward instead, where it sat quietly alongside everything else that couldn't be expressed in the circumstances the war provided. Fact number 34. The makeshift nature of comfort during the waiting years tells its own quiet story about what men valued when ordinary civilian life was stripped away. Soldiers improvised furniture from ammunition crates, constructed windbreaks from whatever materials were available, and decorated their living spaces with photographs cut from magazines, drawings made in spare moments, and pictures sent from home. They grew small gardens in spaces where growing anything was technically unnecessary and logistically absurd. They kept pets, dogs, cats, birds, and in one celebrated case a bear, that had no military function whatsoever but provided a form of emotional connection that the institutional environment couldn't otherwise supply. They named their vehicles, their weapons, their foxholes, and their tents, investing the objects of daily life with the personal significance that civilians invest in the objects of a home. These improvised comforts were not trivial. They were the mechanisms by which men maintained the part of themselves that military routine most systematically threatened: the domestic self, the personal self, the self that had genuine preferences and specific attachments and a particular relationship to physical space. The military understood this, at least implicitly. Regulations that might have prohibited personalizing living quarters were generally enforced with selective leniency during extended garrison periods, because the alternative, an environment so thoroughly stripped of personal expression that nothing felt like anyone's own, would have cost more in the medical and disciplinary records than the small disorder of a soldier's photographs and improvised shelving. Fact number 35. The waiting that preceded the D-Day landings of June 1944 was, in the specific form it took for the men of the Allied invasion forces, among the most intensely managed periods of waiting in the entire war. Troops had been assembling in Britain for months. Some units had been there for years. The southern counties of England were so densely packed with American, British, Canadian, and other Allied soldiers that locals described the whole region as feeling like one enormous, heavily armed garrison town. Men trained, exercised, practiced amphibious landings on beaches selected to approximate the Normandy coastline, attended briefings, received equipment, cleaned that equipment, and waited. The specific period of final confinement, when units were sealed into their marshalling areas in the days immediately before the invasion, forbidden all contact with the civilian population, was described by veterans as among the most psychologically intense waiting of their entire service. They knew in general terms what was coming. They had been told where they were going, which was itself an indication of how close the moment was. The seal on the marshalling areas meant there was nothing left to do. No more preparation, no more training, no more activity of any kind that would improve what was about to happen. They were simply in the final stretch of waiting, with nothing between them and what was coming except time, and time was moving at its usual, completely indifferent pace. Fact number 36. The radio was the sound of the waiting years, and it connected the scattered experience of men in uniform in ways that no other medium could replicate. From small sets in Quonset huts to larger receivers in battalion headquarters to the Armed Forces radio network broadcasting across multiple theaters, radio gave the waiting soldier a thread back to a world that continued to exist beyond his immediate situation. Music was the primary content. The big bands of Glenn Miller, Tommy Dorsey, and Benny Goodman, whose sound defined the sonic landscape of the war years in America and reached forward positions in every theater through recorded broadcasts. Glenn Miller himself joined the army and led a military band that performed for troops across Europe until his aircraft disappeared over the English Channel in December 1944. The loss was felt across the Allied forces as something more than the death of a musician, because his music had become woven into the specific emotional fabric of the waiting years. Radio also brought news, sports results, comedy programs, and the occasional address from Roosevelt or Churchill, which arrived in a foxhole or a tent with the particular quality of a voice speaking directly to the man listening, not to the army, not to the nation as an abstraction, but to the individual holding the receiver in the quiet, with enough stillness around him to actually hear what was being said. Fact number 37. The soldier's diary was written in conditions quite unlike those of any other form of writing, and what it recorded about the waiting is among the most direct evidence available about what the experience actually felt like from the inside. Diaries were technically prohibited in forward areas. A captured diary containing unit information was a genuine security risk. But the prohibition was widely ignored, and thousands of wartime diaries survived to reach archives and private collections long after the war ended. What is most striking about the waiting sections of these diaries, the passages written in garrison or transit between operations, is not the drama they contain, but the persistent, quiet ordinariness of what they record. Today I cleaned my rifle again. Letter from mother. Card game in the evening. Cold again. Nothing is happening. I ate the same food as yesterday. This plainness is not literary modesty. It is the accurate record of days that had no other content, days whose only available subject was the texture of inaction itself. The men who kept diaries during the waiting periods were performing a small act of self-assertion against the institutional erasure of the individual, a way of insisting that these days, whatever they contained or failed to contain, were days in a specific life belonging to a specific person, and were therefore worthy of being noted down, even if what they held was nothing in particular at all. Fact number 38. The moment of combat, when it finally arrived after weeks or months of waiting, was described by veterans with a consistency that is itself informative. It was not what the waiting had prepared them for, not because the training had been inadequate, in most cases it had been thorough, but because the specific psychological state produced by sustained waiting was not, in the end, a functional preparation for the overwhelming immediacy of actual combat. The transition from waiting to fighting was abrupt in a way no training exercise could fully replicate, because no training exercise carried the actual stakes that gave combat its particular and irreducible quality. Veterans described the first moments of fighting as both more intense than anything the waiting had suggested, and in some ways less frightening than the waiting had made it seem, as though the sustained imagination of danger had been, in certain respects, worse than the danger itself. The waiting had been full of thought. Combat was full of action, and action, however terrible, at least demanded something specific of the body and mind, which was a relief in its own way from the formless and unanswerable demand of the waiting that had preceded it. Any defined task, it turned out, was easier to bear than the formless anxiety of having no task at all, even if the task was the hardest thing a man had ever been asked to do. Fact number 39. The physical landscape of waiting was rarely chosen and almost never comfortable, and it ranged across an extraordinary variety of conditions that soldiers were required to inhabit without significant time to adjust. American soldiers trained in Mississippi were shipped to Alaska. British soldiers who had trained in the English countryside found themselves in the North African desert. Australian soldiers expecting the Middle East found themselves defending the jungles of New Guinea. The physical environment in which the waiting occurred was imposed, not selected, and the body's response to extreme environments, sustained heat, deep cold, high altitude, dense humidity, was itself a form of suffering that the official histories tend to pass over quietly. Acclimatization takes time, and during that time the body operates at reduced efficiency in ways that affect everything from physical endurance to emotional resilience. Men waiting in environments they had never previously encountered, in bodies that hadn't yet adjusted to the specific demands of those environments, were waiting with a physical disadvantage that added its own layer to the broader psychological labor of the waiting. A soldier in the Burmese jungle, sweating through a uniform that retained heat rather than releasing it, bitten by insects his immune system had never met before, eating food his digestion wasn't accustomed to, was waiting inside a body that was simultaneously trying to adapt to conditions it had never been designed to handle. The landscape and the waiting were not separate difficulties, they were one continuous experience. Fact number 40. The waiting that followed the end of combat, the demobilization waiting, the going home waiting, has received less historical attention than almost any other form of the broader experience, possibly because it happened after the fighting and therefore belongs, in the conventional narrative, to the story of return rather than the story of service. But for the men who lived through it, the demobilization waiting was often the most psychologically confusing period of the entire war. The fighting had stopped, the immediate danger had ended, the institutional structures that had governed every hour of their existence for years were still technically in place, but beginning to dissolve. Fewer orders, looser discipline, the sense of shared purpose that military life at its best had provided, quietly evaporating without anything yet replacing it. Men waited in staging areas and transit camps for ships that would take them home, sometimes for weeks, sometimes for months, in a condition of institutional limbo that felt different from earlier waiting, precisely because the end of it was finally visible. The psychological adjustment to the knowledge of survival, the specific work of beginning to believe in a future again, of reconnecting with a self that had quietly stopped planning beyond the immediate, was work that began during this period in conditions that were neither quite military nor quite civilian, in a space between what had been and what was about to begin, with no established guidebook and no clear precedent for how to cross it. Fact number 41. The language soldiers developed during the waiting years was its own distinct cultural product, a military vernacular grown from the specific conditions of shared life in closed institutional environments. Every army in the war developed its own slang, its own vocabulary for bureaucratic and physical realities, its own terms of affection and complaint that carried meanings entirely inaccessible to anyone who hadn't been there. The American GI's slang captured, with the compressed precision that good slang always achieves, the gap between the official version of military life and the version the men were actually living. Gold bricking, the art of appearing occupied while doing nothing. Snafu, the Army's own bitterly affectionate acronym for the organized chaos of military operations. Words that encoded institutional absurdity in humor, because humor was the most available and most effective tool at hand. British soldiers drew on a longer tradition of imperial service slang. German soldiers had their Lanzer culture, a word meaning ordinary foot slogger, carrying all the unglamorous and specifically unromantic connotations it was meant to carry. Soviet soldiers had their own parallel vocabulary of sardonic endurance. The language of waiting was a language of realistic deflation, a collective, ongoing refusal to accept the official account of what was happening at full face value. It was the language of people who had enough time and enough shared experience to develop a precise and gently ironic vocabulary for the exact shape of the situation they were living inside. Fact number 42. The chaplain was one of the most important figures in the social life of the waiting army, and his role extended considerably beyond the religious function his title described. Military chaplains of all faiths served as counselors, letter writers for men who struggled to write their own, advocates within the command structure, and the nearest available version of a confidential listener in an environment where confidentiality was otherwise almost entirely absent. Men who would not speak to their officers about what they were feeling, who could not show vulnerability to fellow soldiers without risking the standing that military life required, who had no access to any other form of emotional support. Those men would sometimes speak to a chaplain, not always because they were religious, but because the chaplain's role created a specific social permission for vulnerability that no other military role provided. During the waiting periods, the chaplain's informal presence, moving through the areas where men gathered, available without being intrusive, carrying the particular authority of someone not connected to the command structure, and therefore not in a position to punish what he heard, was a quiet and consistent element of the social fabric that held units together across the long stretches between action. The military funded and staffed the chaplain corps throughout the war because it understood, at a practical level, that the psychological demands of waiting required resources the command structure alone could never supply. Fact number 43. The photograph from home was the most intensely personal object a soldier carried, and what men chose to keep in their shirt pockets, as opposed to in their packs or kit bags, reveals something precise about what they were holding onto across the distance and the duration of the waiting. The photographs that lived in shirt pockets were not random selections. They were the specific images a man needed close: a wife, a girlfriend, a child, parents, a house, a particular view from a window that stood in the quiet economy of memory and longing for everything the waiting was keeping him from. Some men carried the same photograph for years until the image was creased and faded from handling and the people in it were frozen in expressions belonging to a moment years in the past. Some men updated them when new ones arrived in the mail, noting the small changes the gap in time had produced. The children had grown. The wife looked different, older or thinner, or simply different in a way that was hard to name. These small observations appear in soldiers' letters home, with a consistency that makes clear they were one of the central emotional experiences of the waiting years. Not grief exactly, something quieter and more persistent. The gradual, undeniable evidence that time was passing on both sides of the distance and that the world he was waiting to return to was not standing entirely still. Fact number 44. The Japanese soldier's experience of waiting differed from that of his American counterpart in ways that reflected profound differences in military culture, institutional structure, and the specific conditions of the Pacific War. Japanese soldiers were trained in a tradition that demanded not merely obedience but the complete subordination of individual will to collective purpose, and the waiting that resulted had a quality distinct from the restless, card-playing, letter-writing waiting of the American soldier. Japanese soldiers were expected to endure hardship without complaint, and to regard the expression of discomfort or boredom as a form of weakness incompatible with the warrior identity the military required. The psychological cost of this suppression was significant, documented in post-war accounts, but largely invisible during the war itself, absorbed into a culture of stoic endurance that left no official record of what the waiting actually felt like from inside it. The physical conditions for Japanese soldiers in the later stages of the Pacific War were, in many cases, more severe than those of their American counterparts. Supply lines cut off, food exhausted, medical support inadequate or entirely absent. Men on isolated islands waited for reinforcements that had been redirected or destroyed, in conditions that had deteriorated far beyond anything ordinary military waiting described. Understanding their waiting requires understanding not just the military history of the Pacific, but the cultural and philosophical traditions that gave Japanese endurance its particular and deeply demanding character. Fact number 45. The specific waiting that occurred on the eve of an amphibious landing, the hours spent in the holds and on the decks of landing craft, waiting for the order to move towards shore, is perhaps the most acutely described waiting in all of the literature of the Second World War. Men at Normandy, at Guadalcanal, at Tarawa, at Leyte Gulf waited in conditions of real physical discomfort, seasick in many cases, crowded tightly, cold or hot depending on the theater, unable to see what lay ahead, able only to hear the sounds of bombardment without being able to see their source. They waited with full knowledge of what was coming. The ramp would go down and they would move into water and fire and the chaos of a contested beach, and with the clear understanding that nothing could be done to prepare beyond what had already been done. Veterans described this final waiting, sometimes an hour, sometimes several hours, circling in the approaches while the timing was finalized, as producing a strange kind of clarity that stripped everything away except the immediate moment. Fear was present, but it was not the dominant emotion. The dominant emotion, described by veteran after veteran across every major amphibious operation of the war, was something quieter and more specific, a very simple, very human desire for it to simply start, for the ramp to go down, for the waiting to finally become something else, whatever that something else turned out to be. Fact number 46. The German soldiers waiting on the Eastern Front occupied a category of experience so extreme that it sits apart from almost everything else in the history of the war's waiting years. By the winter of 1941 to 1942, German soldiers who had advanced to the outskirts of Moscow found themselves in temperatures that dropped below -40 degrees Celsius, in positions established for a campaign expected to end before winter arrived. They were without adequate winter clothing, without adequate shelter, without adequate supply lines, and under explicit orders forbidding tactical withdrawal regardless of what the military situation actually required. They waited in these conditions for a Soviet offensive that arrived in December 1941 and drove them back across hundreds of kilometers of frozen ground. The men who survived described that first winter as the moment something fundamental changed, the moment the institutional confidence of the early campaign collided directly and irreversibly with a physical reality that no amount of doctrine or ideology could override. The cold did not care about Wehrmacht planning. It did not respond to orders from Berlin. It simply continued, at temperatures that killed unprotected men within hours, and the soldiers waiting in it had no recourse against it except the specific, diminishing, furious warmth of each other's bodies pressed together against the dark. Fact number 47. The connection between waiting and creativity is one of the less obvious but more consistently documented aspects of the soldier's experience. Given enough time and insufficient distraction, men made things. They carved objects from whatever materials were at hand: bone, wood, shell casings, aircraft aluminium. They drew portraits of fellow soldiers and landscapes of wherever they happened to be, and imagined views of wherever they most wanted to return to. They wrote not only letters but poems, short stories, songs, and journals of an ambition that went well beyond the simple diary entry. The creative output of the war's waiting soldiers is preserved in archives and private collections around the world, and it is remarkable both for its sheer volume and for the quality of attention it brings to the specific texture of ordinary days. The drawings soldiers made of their immediate environment, the tent, the foxhole, the view from a particular hillside in a particular afternoon light, are among the most honest documents the war produced, precisely because they were made for no audience and served no institutional purpose. They were simply the product of a man with time on his hands and the need to do something with that time that bore some resemblance to meaning, in conditions that were not always generous about providing meaning in any other form. The making of things, in whatever modest form it took, was the waiting soldier's quietest and most personal act of resistance against the emptiness the war required him to inhabit. Fact number 48. The moment of combat, when it finally arrived after weeks or months of waiting, was not what the waiting had prepared soldiers for. This is not a criticism of the training. In most cases, the training had been thorough and serious. It is simply an observation about the nature of the transition itself. The psychological state produced by sustained waiting, the combination of background anxiety, physical sluggishness, and the particular vigilance that long anticipation generates, was not a clean preparation for the acute, sensory, immediate experience of actual combat. The shift between the two states was abrupt in a way that no exercise could fully replicate, because no exercise carried the specific and irreducible weight of actual consequence. Veterans described the first moments of combat as simultaneously more overwhelming than anything the waiting had suggested, and in some ways less frightening, as though the imagination, given months of unstructured time to work in, had constructed a version of danger more consuming than the real thing. The waiting had been full of thought, circling, unresolvable, inward. Combat was full of action, immediate, physical, outward. And action, however extreme, offered the specific relief of having something defined to do. Any task, it turned out, was easier to inhabit than the formless, open-ended anxiety of waiting for a task that had not yet arrived. Even the hardest task imaginable was, in that narrow sense, a kind of release. Fact number 49. The British soldiers waiting in the imperial garrison postings, Malta, Gibraltar, Egypt, India, Palestine, had a character that the American experience did not replicate, because the British Army carried into those postings a long tradition of overseas service that gave extended foreign deployment an institutional framework the Americans were building largely from scratch. British soldiers who had been in Egypt since before the war began, who had fought at El Alamein and then waited through the long North African campaign, who had been in garrison on Malta through the siege and beyond, inhabited the waiting with the accumulated weight of an imperial soldiering culture that had specific habits, specific expectations, and specific ways of enduring the long stretches between action. The regimental traditions, the particular recreational culture, the relationships with local civilian populations that months of shared proximity produced, these were things the rapidly deployed American soldier did not have access to in the same way. The British waited with more institutional history behind them. Whether that made it easier or harder depended entirely on the specific circumstances of the waiting, which varied across the enormous geographic range of British wartime service, from the merely tedious to the genuinely catastrophic. But the history was there, and it shaped the waiting in ways both visible and quiet, giving the experience a texture quite different from the improvised endurance of armies that were finding their way through it all for the very first time. Fact number 50. The waiting that shaped the war could not be separated from the waiting that shaped the men who fought it. And understanding this is essential to understanding what veterans carried home with them when the war finally ended. The man who returned from 4 or 5 years of service had been changed by the battles, certainly. The histories record those changes carefully, but he had also been changed by the waiting in ways that were more diffuse, more pervasive, and in some respects more permanent. He had learned to exist within sustained institutional control without being destroyed by it. He had learned to manage uncertainty across months and years without collapsing into paralysis. He had learned to find genuine meaning in small things: a letter, a hand of cards, a meal that tasted like something, because the large things were either unavailable or too dangerous to think about directly. He had learned the specific social skills of close-quarters communal living, the management of conflict in an environment where conflict had nowhere to go, the maintenance of functioning relationships under conditions of fatigue and inadequate privacy. These were not trivial skills. They were durable, and they shaped the post-war generation in ways that histories focused on battles have rarely examined with the attention they deserve. The waiting changed the men. The men changed the world they returned to. And the waiting, the long, unglamorous, largely unrecorded waiting, is where a very significant part of that change quietly and permanently happened. Fact number 51. There is something quietly remarkable about the way soldiers learned to read silence. After months in the field, a man could tell the difference between the kind of stillness that meant nothing was happening and the kind that meant something was about to. That sensitivity didn't come from combat training. It came from the long, unremarkable hours spent waiting in camps, along roadsides, and in positions where nothing moved for hours at a stretch. Psychologists who interviewed veterans in the decades after the war noted that many described this heightened awareness not as something developed under fire, but as something quietly tuned during the stretches between engagements. The nervous system, given months of watchful idleness, became extraordinarily sensitive to environmental cues, small shifts in sound, light, and movement that most people would never notice. For some men, this became a genuine asset during combat, allowing them to sense something changing before any formal alert was issued. For others, it became a burden that followed them home, making ordinary domestic life feel strangely unpredictable in ways that were difficult to explain to anyone who hadn't been through it. The waiting, in other words, didn't simply precede the war. It shaped the very way soldiers perceived the world around them, both during their service and for long, quiet decades afterward, in kitchens and living rooms far from any battlefield. Fact number 52. Food occupied a disproportionate amount of mental space during the long waiting periods, and soldiers didn't simply eat to survive. They thought about food, argued about it, and dreamed about it with an intensity that surprised even themselves. Comfort foods from home became emotional shorthand for everything left behind. A mother's recipe, the smell of a familiar bakery, a specific regional dish eaten on a specific occasion. These memories carried a weight far heavier than ordinary nostalgia. When army rations fell short of those memories, which they almost always did, the disappointment carried an emotional charge well beyond mere culinary dissatisfaction. Soldiers became resourceful. They traded cigarettes and tinned goods with local civilians for eggs, fresh bread, and vegetables wherever they were stationed. In Italy, men described bartering rations for pasta dishes prepared by local families, transactions that carried genuine warmth on both sides. In the Pacific, soldiers built crude field kitchens and experimented with local fruits and coconuts to break the monotony of standard rations. The military food supply chain was a logistical achievement of real scale, feeding millions of men across multiple continents simultaneously. But it rarely managed to provide what soldiers actually needed most from a meal, which was never purely nutritional. What they needed was the feeling of being fed by someone who knew them. That particular comfort was the one thing no supply chain could deliver. Fact number 53. Friendships formed during the waiting followed patterns different from those formed in battle, and veterans often recalled both types with equal clarity but very different feelings. Combat bonds were described as fierce, immediate, and sometimes wordless, forged in shared fear and sealed by mutual dependence under fire in moments that passed almost too quickly to fully register. The quieter friendships formed during weeks of shared boredom had their own deep quality. Men who played cards together for months, who listened to each other's stories about home, who sat through the same forgettable films and laughed at the same tired jokes, developed a familiarity that felt almost domestic. These friendships produced an informal support network that military psychologists increasingly recognized as essential to maintaining morale. Studies conducted after the war found that soldiers with close peer connections during idle periods showed significantly lower rates of psychological collapse than those who had remained isolated through the same stretches. The waiting, paradoxically, created the social infrastructure that helped men endure combat when it finally arrived. Many veterans, decades later, describe these quiet waiting period friendships as among the most meaningful relationships of their entire lives, precisely because they had been built not in crisis, but in the long and ordinary days in between, when there was nothing to perform and nothing to prove and simply two people getting through the time together. Fact number 54. The role of music in managing the emotional weight of military waiting is difficult to overstate. Every army in the war understood, by instinct or by deliberate policy, that music was not entertainment in any trivial sense. It was a regulator of something deeper. Marching songs gave soldiers a shared rhythm and a collective voice that briefly overcame the isolation of individual experience. In camp, musicians, professional and amateur alike, were quietly prized. A man who could play guitar, harmonica or piano became an informal community asset, drawing groups together in the evenings and providing a natural gathering point for the hours after dinner when the silence could begin to feel heavy. The USO invested considerable resources in bringing live music to troops across every theater, and the results were measurably positive in morale surveys conducted by the Special Services Division. But it was the informal music that soldiers remembered most vividly. Someone singing quietly in a foxhole, a radio crackling out a Glenn Miller tune across a rain-soaked bivouac in France, a group of men humming together during a night march through cold and dark. These moments weren't organized or scheduled. They simply arose, the way music does when people need it. Music gave the waiting a shape and a feeling when the circumstances themselves offered neither. It was one of the few things available that could reach past the surface of a difficult day and briefly touch something underneath. Fact number 55. News from home arrived in fragments, and soldiers became sophisticated readers of those fragments over time. A letter from a wife that mentioned the neighbor's garden in unusual detail might signal she was carefully avoiding something harder to say. A parent who wrote more frequently than usual, with shorter sentences, could be read as quietly anxious. Men who had spent months parsing these subtle shifts developed a kind of secondary literacy, an ability to read emotional tone beneath the carefully managed surface of letters that had been written, on both sides, with a censor somewhere in mind. Soldiers couldn't describe where they were or what they had witnessed. Families were gently encouraged by wartime information campaigns not to burden their men with difficult domestic news. The result was a carefully maintained performance of reassurance on both sides of the correspondence, in which genuine feeling had to find its way through the available words as best it could. Veterans described the experience of receiving letters as simultaneously joyful and quietly frustrating. Joy at the contact, frustration at the gap between what was written and what was actually meant. In some cases, these carefully navigated letters preserved relationships across enormous distance and time. In others, the accumulated silences created a distance of their own kind, one that only became fully visible after the war ended and the men came home and discovered that some of the gaps couldn't simply be closed by returning. Fact number 56. In the months after major campaigns ended and before new operations began, soldiers occupied a bureaucratic and psychological no man's land that historians have come to call the operational pause. These pauses could last weeks or months, and they imposed a particular kind of difficulty. Unlike the waiting before a known operation, which carried anxiety but also a sense of direction, the operational pause had no defined endpoint. Men didn't know whether they would be sent forward again in days or reassigned entirely. They were too close to the front to fully relax, yet too far from action to feel the focused clarity that combat required. They existed in a state of incomplete readiness, which was its own specific and wearing condition. Military historians studying the European theatre found that disciplinary incidents, fights, insubordination, unauthorized absence, peaked during these operational pauses rather than before or during battles. The explanation wasn't that soldiers became worse people during quiet periods. It was that the absence of clear purpose and timeline left psychological energy with nowhere to go, and energy with nowhere to go eventually finds its own outlet. Commands responded with work details, repetitive exercises, and inspections, manufactured purpose that soldiers recognized immediately for what it was, and resented even as they participated. The operational pause revealed, perhaps more clearly than any other period of the war, just how much discipline depended not on force but on a shared and genuine sense of direction. Fact number 57. There is a particular category of waiting that soldiers in every theatre described with unusual precision. The wait immediately after orders had been issued but before movement could begin. This was not the long, formless waiting of camp life. It was a compressed, sharply focused period in which everything had been set in motion mentally but nothing could yet happen physically. Maps had been studied, equipment had been checked and checked again, the mission was understood. There was simply nothing left to do but sit and let time pass at its own unhurried pace. Veterans described this short, specific period as among the most difficult of the entire war, precisely because it combined full knowledge of what was coming with complete inability to influence or hasten it. Some men prayed, others wrote letters home they hoped would never need to be sent. Some talked with an almost compulsive energy about entirely unrelated things. Food, plans, the future, as though filling the silence with ordinary life might hold the extraordinary at bay for a few minutes longer. A few went very quiet in a way their comrades recognized and respected without needing to comment on. This waiting was a form of psychological work, exhausting, necessary, and entirely invisible in the official record of what any given operation required of the men who carried it out. It left no entry in any log. It appeared in no after-action report. It simply happened in the space between the order and the beginning, and every man who ever received orders carried it alone. Fact number 58. The experience of waiting differed significantly between officers and enlisted men, and the gap was as much psychological as it was organizational. Officers carried the weight of planning and responsibility during idle periods, which meant their waiting was rarely empty. It was occupied with contingency thinking, personnel concerns, and the management of other people's morale on top of their own. Enlisted men, by contrast, experienced waiting as something imposed from outside, a condition endured rather than occupied, with little agency over its shape or duration. This distinction produced different kinds of fatigue. Officers reported higher rates of anxiety and decision exhaustion during extended pauses. Enlisted men more commonly described boredom, restlessness, and a creeping sense of purposelessness. Yet across all ranks, letters and diaries from these periods reveal a shared human undercurrent, the simple wish that something, almost anything, would happen to break the suspension. The sociologist Samuel Stouffer, who led a landmark study of American soldiers during and after the war, found that morale and psychological stability correlated less with the objective danger of a soldier's situation than with whether he felt his time had meaning. Waiting without meaning was, in Stouffer's data, more psychologically damaging than waiting in acknowledged danger, a finding that was striking at the time and continues to influence how military organizations think about the management of their people during the long and quiet stretches between the moments that history tends to notice. Fact number 59. The physical environment of waiting left marks on soldiers that weren't always immediately visible. Weeks spent in damp trenches, waterlogged bivouacs, or sun-baked staging areas produced a range of chronic conditions: trench foot, fungal infections, joint damage from irregular sleep surfaces, skin problems from sustained exposure, that accumulated quietly and showed their full cost only in later life. Veterans' medical records, studied decades after the war, showed elevated rates of musculoskeletal and dermatological conditions traceable not to specific battles but to the sustained physical exposure of camp and transit life. The body bore the cost of waiting in its own way, separate from the more visible injuries of combat, and far less likely to be acknowledged. Military medical officers were aware of this during the war itself. Field surgeons' reports from 1943 and 1944 flagged the prevalence of preventable chronic conditions among troops in static positions, but the demands of active campaigns meant that low-grade ailments were deprioritized, treated as background noise against the louder requirements of keeping fighting men in the field. The soldiers themselves rarely complained, partly from stoicism and partly because the discomfort had become so constant it simply felt normal. Only after the war, when the baseline shifted back toward ordinary civilian life, did many veterans begin to realize how much the waiting had quietly and persistently cost them in purely physical terms, costs that had been accumulating all along, invisibly, in the body's patient accounting. Fact number 60. Among the more unexpected consequences of prolonged military waiting was the degree to which it changed soldiers' relationship with time itself. Civilians in peacetime move through days structured by personal choice, work rhythms, and social life. Military waiting stripped most of that structure away, replacing it with a clock whose movements were entirely outside any individual's control. Men could not decide when to eat, when to move, or when to rest based on their own preferences or needs. Days blurred into one another in ways that veterans repeatedly described as genuinely disorienting. Some men lost track of the month without noticing. Others found, after extended service, that they could no longer clearly recall the sequence of events within a given week. Psychologists studying veterans in the post-war decades noted that this temporal disruption was not simply a matter of poor record-keeping. It represented something more fundamental, a genuine reorganization of how time was experienced at a basic level. Men who had lived through years of military waiting often described peacetime as feeling either overwhelmingly busy or unnervingly empty, as though the civilian clock and the military clock operated in fundamentally different modes that couldn't simply be switched between. Adjusting to one after years of the other was for many veterans among the quieter and least discussed challenges of coming home, a disorientation without a name, a rhythm that had to be relearned from the beginning, in a world that assumed everyone already knew how it went. Fact number 61. Soldiers waiting in the North African desert encountered a landscape that seemed almost designed to make time feel infinite. The Sahara imposed its own slow rhythm on human activity, brutal heat in the middle of the day, surprising cold at night, and a visual monotony so complete that it became difficult to track the passage of hours in any ordinary way. British and Commonwealth troops stationed in Egypt and Libya between campaigns described a particular kind of desert listlessness, the sun bleaching not just the sand but motivation, appetite, and the capacity for normal social interaction. Water rationing added a physical edge to the psychological difficulty. Men couldn't bathe properly, couldn't wash clothes effectively, and endured the constant low-level discomfort of sand in every surface and every fold of clothing. Letters home from desert station troops in 1941 and 1942 frequently noted the strange timelessness of the environment, the way a full day could pass without a single event worth recording, and yet leave a man feeling entirely exhausted by the end of it. Military chaplains and welfare officers working in North Africa reported that the desert waiting produced a particular kind of spiritual flatness, a temporary erosion of hope and forward-looking thought that required specific and patient pastoral attention. The desert, it turned out, was as formidable an adversary during the waiting as the enemy had been during the fighting, and it worked on a man in ways that were slower, quieter, and considerably harder to name. Fact number 62. The waiting experienced by prisoners of war occupied its own extreme category, one that combined the psychological weight of ordinary military waiting with captivity, hunger, fear, and the complete absence of any sense of agency or timeline. Prisoners held in German stalags or Japanese prison camps could not know whether their captivity would last months or years, whether they would be liberated, transferred, or something worse. They developed extraordinarily elaborate internal routines to resist the psychological erosion that such sustained uncertainty produced. Secret educational programs emerged in many camps, with prisoners teaching each other languages, mathematics, history, and practical skills. Amateur theatrical groups performed with improvised costumes and whatever space could be found. Sports leagues were organized on whatever ground was available. These activities were not merely diversions. Post-war psychological studies confirmed they were deliberate and remarkably effective strategies for maintaining mental coherence under conditions specifically designed to undermine it. The men who fared best in captivity, researchers consistently found, were not necessarily the physically strongest. They were the ones who had found a way to impose internal structure on externally imposed waiting, to keep time meaningful even when everything around them was designed to make it feel formless and endless. The discipline of making each day matter, even in confinement, turned out to be one of the war's most quietly profound and genuinely human acts of resistance. Fact number 63. The homecoming itself was, for many soldiers, a form of waiting they had not anticipated. After years of service, the return to civilian life began not with immediate celebration, but with a new and unfamiliar kind of suspension. Demobilization was a bureaucratic process measured in weeks and sometimes months, during which men who had survived the war waited in staging areas, on troop ships, and in processing centers, sometimes longer than they had waited before going into combat. The psychological literature on reintegration, developed primarily through the 1950s, identified this transitional period as a genuine risk, a time during which the identity frameworks that military service had provided began to dissolve before new civilian ones could form to replace them. Men who had known exactly who they were within a unit, a rank, and a role suddenly found themselves without those anchors. The home they returned to had changed while they were gone. Family members had adapted to absence, children had grown, wives had become more independent, neighborhoods had shifted in ways both visible and subtle. Veterans described a peculiar grief during this period, not grief for anything lost to the war, but for the strangeness of a familiar world that no longer quite fit. The waiting that had shaped them during service followed them quietly into peacetime, leaving its imprint on how they moved through ordinary life long after the uniform had been folded away and put in a drawer that didn't get opened very often. Fact number 64. Soldiers stationed in Britain in the years before D-Day experienced a form of waiting unique in its combination of proximity to a functioning civilian world and complete inability to return to their own. American, Canadian, and Commonwealth troops billeted in English villages and market towns in 1942, 1943, and early 1944 were close enough to domestic warmth to feel its comfort, and far enough from their own homes to feel its absence with particular sharpness. The communities that hosted them responded with a mixture of genuine hospitality and understandable caution. British families opened spare rooms, shared rationed food, and organized dances and film evenings for troops who were restless and waiting for something none of them could yet name openly. American soldiers in particular found British social life surprising in its differences: the quieter pubs, the more reserved manner, the particular dry humor that took getting used to. Cultural friction was common, especially between American and British troops competing for local attention and goodwill. But beneath these surface tensions, diaries and letters from both sides consistently describe something warmer developing over the long waiting months. For many American soldiers, the English villages where they waited became a kind of surrogate home, places that had known them during the long suspension before the war's most decisive moment, and which they remembered for the rest of their lives with a tenderness that time only seemed to deepen rather than diminish. Fact number 65. The spiritual dimension of military waiting received less historical attention than its psychological or social aspects, yet the accounts soldiers left behind suggest it was among the most significant. Chaplains attached to units in every theater reported that religious practice, prayer, scripture reading, attendance at services, rose sharply during waiting periods rather than only in the immediate approach to combat. Men who described themselves as non-religious in civilian life frequently found themselves returning to childhood prayers during the long, idle hours between operations. This wasn't simply the fear of impending danger. It was something more diffuse and harder to name, a reaching for meaning, continuity, and connection that the emptiness of waiting made unusually urgent. Letters home from these periods are filled with references to God, fate, and a quiet philosophical reckoning with mortality that had very little to do with any specific approaching threat. It was the reckoning of men with too much time and too much interior space, men who had been given by the waiting the unusual and not always welcome opportunity to think seriously about what they believed and why. Historians of religion and war have noted that the Second World War produced a generation of men who had conducted an extended private spiritual inquiry during the downtime of service, an inquiry that shaped their post-war relationship with faith, community, and a question of how a life should be lived in ways that rarely appeared in public discourse but were deeply present in how they actually lived. Fact number 66. In the Pacific Theater, the particular geography of island hopping created a waiting experience defined almost entirely by water. Between island campaigns, troops were loaded onto transports and held offshore for days or weeks at a time, within sight of land they couldn't reach, surrounded by an ocean that offered neither comfort nor distraction. The naval vessels weren't designed for long-term habitation by large infantry units. Men slept in tiered bunks with inches of clearance between them, ate in rotating shifts, and had almost no private space to think or breathe or simply be alone. Boredom on the transports was a recognized operational concern, and special services officers aboard ships organized lectures, film showings, and improvised talent nights with the explicit aim of managing the psychological risk of enforced idleness at sea. The heat in equatorial waters added a physical dimension that ground operations rarely matched. Temperatures below deck in some vessels climbed well above 100 degrees Fahrenheit, making genuine rest nearly impossible. Medical officers aboard Pacific transports in 1943 and 1944 noted a consistent correlation between the length of the transit period and the rate of psychiatric referrals in the first week after landing. The quality of waiting at sea, their reports suggested, had a direct and measurable effect on soldiers' readiness for combat when they finally reached shore. Evidence, if any, were needed, that the waiting was never simply time passing. It was always doing something to the men inside it. Fact number 67. The language soldiers developed during waiting periods is itself a historical artifact worth examining carefully. Every military formation produced its own vocabulary for idle time. Words and phrases that encoded shared frustrations, dark humor, and the particular solidarity of men who were bored together in the same place for the same reasons. The American phrase snafu, an acronym for a bluntly impolite description of institutional chaos, was born in the staging areas and waiting rooms of the early war, where bureaucratic confusion was the dominant daily experience. British troops contributed fatigues and jankers to the vocabulary of enforced idleness, words that captured the specific indignity of being given pointless tasks as a disciplinary measure or morale exercise. German soldiers had Langeweile, literally long while, as their standard word for boredom, a linguistic acknowledgement that time itself was the primary adversary during static periods. In the Pacific, American Marines developed gold bricking for the refined art of appearing occupied while doing absolutely nothing, a skill that became something of a minor cultural institution in long garrisoned positions. These words outlasted the war, passing into civilian language and carrying with them a faint but persistent residue of the human experience that had produced them. The experience of men who had too much time and no way useful to put it, and who, with the particular ingenuity of the board, found a way to name it precisely. Fact number 68. One of the war's least celebrated logistical achievements was the sustained management of soldier morale during extended transit. Moving millions of men across oceans and continents in the 1940s involved not merely ships, railways, and trucks, but the careful psychological management of the people inside them during the long stretches when nothing was happening. The American Army's Special Services Division, established in 1941, eventually employed over 20,000 personnel, whose entire function was to ensure soldiers had meaningful activities during idle periods. They distributed books, organized film screenings, facilitated sports competitions, and trained unit-level recreation officers whose job was simply to find ways to make the time matter. Their budget, which reached tens of millions of dollars by 1944, was justified not as a luxury provision but as an operational necessity, a formal recognition that a psychologically disengaged army was a functionally degraded army, and that the cost of preventing disengagement was far lower than the cost of managing its consequences. British and Commonwealth forces had parallel structures, though typically smaller in scale. The underlying logic was one that military commanders had understood in various forms since ancient times but had rarely articulated clearly as policy. that an army which has learned how to wait productively is more resilient, more coherent, and ultimately more effective when the moment of commitment arrives. The people who made that productive waiting possible were doing as much for the war's outcome, in their quiet way, as anyone who planned a campaign or led an assault. Fact number 69. The relationship between soldiers and the civilians of occupied or liberated territories was often formed not in dramatic moments of encounter, but during the quiet, extended time of waiting. When units were billeted in French, Italian, or Dutch towns during operational pauses, the sustained daily contact between soldiers and local people produced relationships that neither side had particularly anticipated or planned for. Children were invariably drawn to soldiers, who often had sweets to share and a willingness to play that adult civilians in occupied territories had largely lost somewhere along the way. Adults who initially kept a cautious distance frequently warmed across days and weeks of shared proximity. Veterans described these civilian encounters as among the most humanizing experiences of the entire war, moments when the machinery of conflict receded and something more ordinary took its place. A French family sharing meals with American soldiers during a 3-week supply halt. An Italian villager patiently teaching a Canadian sergeant the rudiments of his language. A Dutch shopkeeper quietly passing information to troops who had become familiar faces on the street. These interactions accumulated into a texture of human contact that no official history adequately captured, precisely because they happened during the time that history tends to skip over. They happened in the waiting, in the ordinary, unhurried days between the events worth recording, and they were, for the people on both sides of them, often the most human and most remembered part of what the war had been. Fact number 70. Sleep, or the chronic and persistent lack of it, was perhaps the single most universal physical experience of wartime waiting, and its effects quietly ran through every other aspect of soldier life. Military schedules routinely disrupted basic sleep. Guard rosters broke rest into irregular fragments. Reveille was set at hours designed for institutional convenience rather than human recovery, and the noise and discomfort of camp life made genuine rest difficult even when time was formally available for it. Sleep deprivation accumulated slowly and invisibly over months, lowering emotional regulation, impairing judgment, and increasing interpersonal friction in ways that were difficult to attribute directly but were unmistakably present in any unit that had been in garrison for an extended period. Post-war research on veterans' health found elevated rates of chronic sleep disorders among former servicemen, disorders that persisted decades after demobilization and could be traced, in part, to the disrupted sleep patterns of waiting period camp life, rather than to combat exposure alone. Soldiers who managed to carve out reliable rest during static periods, through arrangements with sympathetic NCOs, or by simply mastering the practical art of sleeping in improbable conditions, were measurably better at managing stress when active operations resumed. The ability to sleep well amid chaos turned out to be one of the more quietly valuable skills a soldier could develop during the long, apparently unproductive hours of the waiting. Not heroic, not celebrated, but real and durable and worth more than it looked. Fact number 71. The experience of waiting was not identical across the racial and ethnic lines that divided the military forces of the Second World War. For African American soldiers serving in a still segregated American army, the waiting periods of camp life carried an additional and specific burden. The daily confrontation with institutional inequality in a war being fought, at least in its public language, for democratic values and human freedom. Black soldiers in American camps in the South were subject to Jim Crow regulations requiring separate facilities, separate USO clubs, and separate spaces for almost every aspect of daily life. Sometimes they watched German prisoners of war, the enemy, being served in restaurants that refused service to American servicemen of color. These experiences were widely documented in letters home and in reports compiled by civil rights organizations throughout the war. The psychological cost of this particular kind of waiting for dignity, for basic respect, for the country to apply its stated values to its own citizens, was distinct from any other form of military idleness the war produced. It was waiting layered on waiting, with no clear endpoint and no institutional acknowledgement that anything was wrong. Veterans of the Buffalo Soldiers and other black units described this double waiting as the defining emotional register of their entire service, waiting for the war to end, and waiting, with considerably less certainty about the outcome, for America to become what it had always claimed to be. Fact number 72. Among German soldiers on the Eastern Front, waiting took on a quality that has no precise parallel anywhere else in the history of the war. The sheer scale of the theater, the distances involved, and the physical brutality of the climate meant that even static periods were rarely anything close to comfortable in any ordinary sense. In the winter of 1941 to 1942, hundreds of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers found themselves in positions for which they had no adequate equipment, no proper winter coats, no suitable boots, no antifreeze for vehicles, because the German High Command had planned for a short campaign that would be concluded before winter arrived. It wasn't. Letters from German soldiers during this period, many studied by military historians in later decades, show a striking shift in psychological tone. The confidence and ideological energy of the early campaign months gave way to something quieter, more searching, and ultimately more recognizably human. Men who had written home in 1941 with the vocabulary of anticipated victory wrote in early 1942 in the vocabulary of endurance, the language of people who had stopped thinking about the future and started simply trying to survive the present, one day at a time, one night at a time, against a cold that didn't negotiate and didn't pause and didn't care at all about the plans that had been made in offices far away, by people who had never stood in it. Fact number 73. The act of writing, letters, diaries, poems, informal memoirs, was one of the primary ways soldiers gave shape and meaning to the experience of waiting, and the archive that survives from this writing is among the richest historical records of inner life that any modern conflict has ever produced. The Second World War generated an estimated 16 billion pieces of mail on the American side alone, and a meaningful portion of this correspondence consists not of dramatic accounts of combat, but of patient, detailed descriptions of ordinary waiting days. The smell of a bivouac at dawn, the taste of reconstituted eggs, the sound of a radio playing across an empty parade ground in the early evening. These descriptions were not incidental to the letter's emotional purpose. They were the purpose. Soldiers writing home were attempting to transmit the actual texture of their experience, to bridge the gap between where they were and where their families were. And the most honest material available for that bridge was the ordinary time of waiting, rather than the exceptional time of battle. The result is a body of writing that, read carefully and with the attention it deserves, reveals the Second World War not as an uninterrupted series of heroic acts, but as a long, patient, deeply human process of endurance, punctuated by moments of violence and shaped more profoundly by the hours in between than any official history has quite managed to convey. Fact number 74. Soldiers who served across multiple theaters described a curious and consistent phenomenon. The specific quality of waiting changed with geography in ways that were difficult to articulate but were immediately recognizable to anyone who had experienced more than one. Waiting in the hedgerow country of Normandy after the breakout had a particular feeling, watchful and compressed, the trees and fields limiting visibility and keeping anxiety perpetually near the surface even during periods of complete quiet. Waiting in the open desert of North Africa was different. Vast, exposed and oddly meditative for some men, who described the emptiness as almost restful once they had made their peace with the scale of it. Waiting in the Pacific jungle was different again. Hot and insect-ridden and loud with unfamiliar biological noise. The environment itself an adversary even in the complete absence of the enemy. These environmental signatures of waiting were not incidental to the emotional experience of the war. They were constitutive of it. They gave each campaign its specific character in memory and feeling. Veterans who had served in more than one theater consistently found that their memories of different campaigns were anchored not primarily in battles but in the feel of the waiting, the particular light, the specific smells, the sounds of a place during the long hours when nothing was officially happening. Geography, in this sense, became the archive in which the war's waiting was most durably and most personally preserved. Fact number 75. What soldiers thought about during the hours when they had nothing particular to do is something military historians have approached more cautiously than the question of what soldiers did. Because thinking, unlike action, leaves records only when it is written down, and much of it was not. Yet the letters, diaries, oral histories, and post-war memoirs that have been carefully collected and studied consistently point toward a set of recurring mental preoccupations that cut across national, cultural, and individual differences with remarkable consistency. Foremost among them was home, not in an abstract patriotic sense, but in the specific, sensory, almost domestic sense. The sound of a particular voice, the arrangement of furniture in a familiar room, the smell of a kitchen in a specific season. Close behind this was a recurring rehearsal of the future, plans and contingencies, and the imagined shape of post-war life, which served as both emotional sustenance and a quiet psychological hedge against the possibility that the future might not arrive. And alongside these ran a quieter, harder current of reflection about meaning, whether the war was worth its cost, whether any individual death could be justified within the scale of the enterprise, whether the world that followed would honor what was being sacrificed to reach it. These were not always articulate thoughts, but they were present, and they constituted the real interior life of the war's long waiting, the part that happened in silence and left the deepest marks. Fact number 76. The Red Army's experience of waiting between operations was shaped by institutional conditions that differed substantially from those of Western Allied forces. Soviet soldiers received fewer official morale services, had far less reliable access to personal correspondence, and operated within a command culture that emphasized collective obligation over individual well-being in ways that made the acknowledgement of personal difficulty genuinely risky. Yet the human impulse toward community, humor, and creative expression found its way through these constraints in recognizable forms. Soviet field units developed robust informal cultures, strong storytelling traditions, amateur musical performances, and bonds of personal loyalty that existed alongside and sometimes in quiet tension with the rigid formal hierarchy. Political commissars assigned to units were required to manage morale as well as ideology, and their reports from waiting periods reveal that the concerns of Red Army soldiers during downtime were strikingly similar to those of their counterparts on every other side of the conflict. Food, letters, physical comfort, uncertainty about the future, and the persistent quiet longing for the war to simply be over. The universality of this experience across radically different military cultures and political systems suggests something important about waiting itself. Its fundamental human character, the boredom, the longing, the need for connection and meaning, was resistant to institutional management in any direction. Beneath the uniforms and the ideologies and the different languages, the waiting felt, in its essentials, much the same everywhere. Fact number 77. Soldiers who had been waiting for a very long time developed a curious and particular relationship with hope, one that differed from anything recognizable in ordinary civilian experience. In peacetime, hope moves fairly freely, attaching itself to career prospects, personal relationships, seasonal changes, weekend plans. In the military waiting of wartime, hope became something narrower and more carefully managed. Men described hoping not for large or distant things, victory, safety, a better world, but for small, immediate, achievable ones. A warm meal, a dry place to sleep tonight, a letter arriving in tomorrow's mail, 2 hours without being called for a work detail. Hope kept close and kept small, calibrated precisely to what was actually achievable in the near term. This narrowing of hope was, according to post-war psychological studies, a sophisticated and genuinely effective adaptive strategy. By keeping hope within reach, soldiers maintained a functional optimism that didn't expose them to the devastating disappointments that larger and more distant hopes inevitably brought when they failed to materialize. Veterans who were studied decades after the war frequently described this recalibrated sense of hope as one of the lasting practical gifts of their service, a wisdom about where to direct desire and expectation that served them well in the unexpected difficulties of civilian life. The war had taught them, in the long quiet hours of waiting, how to hope well, modestly, specifically, close to the ground, and that turned out to be knowledge worth keeping. Fact number 78. The experience of waiting in field hospitals, whether as patients or as the medical staff caring for them, occupied its own difficult and particular emotional territory. For wounded men, the hospital period was a form of waiting defined by physical pain, institutional dependency, and uncertain outcome, combined with the strange and persistent guilt of being out of the fight while comrades remained in it. Survivors of serious wounds described a specific emotional oscillation during their recovery time: relief at being alive, grief at separation from their unit, anxiety about whether the body would heal well enough to return to duty, and a reluctant gratitude for the enforced rest that the wound had compelled but that they hadn't been able to simply choose for themselves. Medical staff, meanwhile, waited between surges of casualties in a state of exhausted preparedness, aware that the quiet could end at any moment, and that the next hours might demand absolutely everything they had. Military psychiatrists noted that the recovery period, particularly for men who had been in sustained combat before being wounded, was frequently when the psychological costs of the war first became clearly visible. In the stillness of a hospital bed, with the noise and movement of active service no longer available to absorb attention, what had been kept at a manageable distance during the fighting finally found the space and the quiet to make itself fully felt. Fact number 79. The Japanese military tradition of endurance, expressed in the concept of gaman, the bearing of hardship with patience and quiet dignity, gave Japanese soldiers a cultural framework for waiting that their Allied counterparts did not share in the same form. Pacific theater soldiers on isolated islands who had been effectively cut off from resupply after 1943 waited under conditions of progressive physical deterioration, maintaining their positions not because relief was coming. Logistically, it could not, but because the cultural and military framework within which they operated provided no other recognized response. The psychological costs of this sustained suppression were significant, documented in post-war accounts, but during the war itself they were largely invisible, absorbed into a culture of stoic endurance that left no official record of what the waiting actually felt like from inside it. The most extreme example, Hiro Onoda, who continued his mission in the Philippine jungle until 1974, was extraordinary in its duration but not entirely surprising in its underlying logic. It represented the outer edge of a philosophy of waiting shaped by culture, military training, and institutional commitment into something that went well beyond ordinary discipline. Understanding this waiting requires understanding not just the military history of the Pacific but the deeper, cultural and philosophical traditions that gave Japanese endurance its particular and formidable character. Traditions in which the boundary between patience and sacrifice was drawn in a very different place than it was in any Western military culture of the same period. Fact number 80. By the end of the war, as Allied forces moved across Germany in the spring of 1945 and Japanese resistance in the Pacific began to contract, soldiers found themselves experiencing a new and entirely unexpected form of waiting for the end itself. Victory was clearly approaching, and yet the fighting continued, and men who had survived the full length of the war now faced the possibility of dying in its final weeks. That possibility, statistically, some of them did face, and it carried a quality different from any earlier risk: the specific weight of being this close and still not safe. Veterans described the psychological state of these final months with unusual emotional precision. A combination of desperate caution, accumulated survivor's guilt, and a quietly absurd awareness of how much military chance cared about nobody's proximity to the finish line. The men most acutely affected were those who had already received word of their post-war plans, accepted college places, promised jobs, arranged marriages, and who therefore felt, more sharply than others, the gap between the life that was waiting and the war that still had to be endured. Military chaplains and medical officers recorded a rise in anxiety and sleep disturbances during this final period, even as combat intensity decreased in many sectors. The waiting for the war to end was, in its own way, as demanding as any waiting that had come before it. Perhaps more so because by then the men knew, with painful precision, exactly what they had to lose. Fact number 81. Veterans who returned from the war and entered the workforce frequently demonstrated a capacity for patience under institutional pressure that their employers found genuinely notable. The waiting of wartime service had effectively trained them in the practical art of tolerating bureaucratic delay, ambiguous timelines, and the absence of immediate feedback. Skills that translated with surprising directness into the working cultures of the post-war corporate and government world. This is not a coincidental overlap. The organizational forms that dominated American and European economic life in the 1950s and 1960s were shaped in part by men who had absorbed their working habits during military service, and those habits included a particular and hard-won tolerance for the kind of suspended and purposeless time that institutional life occasionally required. Historians of the post-war period have noted that the veterans cohort had an unusually high threshold for institutional frustration, not because they were passive or incurious, but because they had already survived forms of waiting that made ordinary workplace delays feel genuinely manageable by comparison. This quiet translation of wartime psychological skills into peacetime institutional life was one of the less visible but more durable legacies that the experience of waiting left on the generation that had lived through it. A practical legacy, unglamorous and unacknowledged, built not from what they had done during the war, but from what they had simply and patiently endured. Fact number 82. The children of veterans grew up hearing stories about the war, and what is striking, looking back, is how rarely those stories were about combat. Family narratives of wartime service were overwhelmingly narratives of waiting. The long sea crossing, the card games in camp, the funny incident with the mess cook, the village in France where the unit was billeted for 3 rainy weeks in the autumn. These were the stories that could be told at a dinner table. They fit the rhythms of family life. They were accessible to children and didn't require the emotional armor that combat stories demanded. Armor that many veterans either hadn't yet built or simply preferred not to put on at home. In choosing what to pass on, veterans instinctively selected the waiting, its humor, its small human texture, its capacity for ordinary moments, as the part of the war that could be shared without cost. The result was a family-transmitted memory of wartime service that emphasized endurance, companionship, and finding meaning in unremarkable circumstances. This inherited memory shaped the next generation's understanding of the war in ways subtly but significantly different from the version recorded in official histories or constructed by Hollywood films. The waiting, passed quietly down through family stories at kitchen tables across the country, became the war's most widely shared and most intimately human inheritance, the version that actually lived on in the people who came after. Fact number 83. The concept of military readiness is, at its core, a theory of productive waiting. An army that is ready is an army that has learned how to exist in a state of not yet deployed while fully maintaining its capacity to become deployed at short notice. The work of maintaining that readiness, through training, equipment care, physical fitness, psychological stability, and unit cohesion, is not glamorous and does not feature in the accounts that reach public attention. But the officers and NCOs who managed readiness during the waiting periods of the Second World War were exercising a form of leadership as demanding in its own way as combat command. They had to sustain purpose in the absence of immediate threat, maintain discipline without the compliance enforcer of immediate danger, and keep men psychologically oriented toward a mission that might be weeks or months away. The best of them did this through genuine engagement, taking an interest in their men as individuals, explaining the strategic context when they were able to, finding ways to make the small repetitive tasks of waiting feel connected to something larger. The worst did it through coercion and manufactured busywork, generating a specific and durable resentment that sometimes outlasted the war itself. The quality of a unit's waiting was in this very direct sense a reflection of the quality of its leadership, perhaps the most honest and least flattering mirror that the war held up to the people in charge of other people's days. Fact number 84. The Second World War is often remembered as the last conflict in which entire civilian populations were fully mobilized in support of the military effort, and this total mobilization had a quiet but significant effect on the home front's experience of waiting. Families who had sent sons, husbands, and fathers into service did not simply wait passively for their return. They were drawn into an economy of waiting that had its own demands, its own structures, and its own carefully constructed meaning. Rationing, war bond drives, factory shifts, and civil defense work gave civilians a productive character that was explicitly designed by governments to prevent the psychological erosion that pure passivity would have produced. The propaganda apparatus of every major belligerent invested heavily in images of purposeful civilian endurance, the British instinct to keep calm and carry on, the American image of productive women filling industrial roles, the general insistence that staying busy at home was itself a contribution to the outcome. The degree to which these campaigns succeeded varied enormously by context and by individual circumstance, but they shared a common and clear-eyed recognition that managing the home front's waiting was as strategically important as managing the soldiers waiting on the other side of the ocean. That waiting at home, like waiting in uniform, needed to be given a shape and a purpose and a reason to continue, or it would quietly become something more difficult and more costly than any government could easily manage. Fact number 85. Among the most enduring forms of waiting in the entire history of the Second World War was the waiting of families who did not know whether a loved one was alive. The category of the missing, soldiers whose fate had not been confirmed as either survival or death, created a suspension of grief that ordinary bereavement could not reach and ordinary consolation could not address. Families of the missing could not mourn fully, because mourning required a finality that the missing status withheld. They could not move forward, because moving forward felt like abandonment. They existed in a prolonged and unresolved emotional state that psychologists would eventually recognize as a form of disenfranchised grief. Grief without social permission. Grief without a clear endpoint. Grief that had no established ritual or recognized shape. Organizations dedicated to accounting for the war's missing, including the American Graves Registration Service and its successors, worked for decades after the war's end to resolve these cases, and their work continues today. Advances in DNA forensics have allowed identifications that were impossible for a generation after the fighting stopped, each one closing a waiting that has sometimes stretched across 80 years. Each identification is a final, quiet answer to the longest waiting the war produced. Not on any battlefield, but in the kitchens and living rooms of people whose sons and husbands went out one day and simply, without explanation or ceremony, did not come back. Fact number 86. The oral histories of women who served in military logistics, communications and intelligence during the war reveal a waiting experience that has been even less documented than that of male soldiers. Women serving in the Women's Army Corps, the British ATS, the WWII, and equivalent organizations across the Allied world experienced the same institutional rhythms of hurry and wait that characterized all military service, but without the cultural framework that made military waiting legible, or even visible, as a form of meaningful endurance. Their waiting was more likely to be described as administrative idleness and less likely to be acknowledged as the kind of stoic patience the culture chose to celebrate. Yet the work these women performed during operational pauses, maintaining communication networks, processing intelligence, managing logistical records, was precisely what kept the military machine functional and ready during the intervals between active crises. The women who staffed the Bombay rooms at Bletchley Park worked in shifts requiring sustained, exacting concentration interspersed with long periods of careful monitoring. The waiting between significant intercepts was itself a form of skilled and demanding attention that required everything a person had. Their contribution to the management of wartime waiting, keeping the systems alive and ready during the quiet stretches between emergencies, is among the most systematically underappreciated forms of service the war produced, carried out by people who were rarely asked about it afterward, and rarely offered the occasion to describe what it had actually been like from the inside. Fact number 87. The waiting that soldiers endured between the official end of fighting and the completion of demobilization, sometimes called the brownout period, generated a specific and historically significant form of discontent. By the autumn of 1945, hundreds of thousands of American servicemen in Europe and the Pacific had been told the war was over, yet found themselves still in uniform, still subject to military orders, and still waiting for the slow machinery of demobilization to process their return to civilian life. The frustration this produced was not trivial. Protests and demonstrations occurred at American bases in the Philippines, in Germany and elsewhere, with soldiers publicly demanding accelerated discharge, an extraordinarily unusual event in the history of a military that had maintained remarkable discipline through years of genuine hardship and danger. Historians of the demobilization period have argued that these protests reflected not simply impatience but a genuine psychological crisis. Men who had organized their entire inner lives around the goal of coming home discovered that even the achievement of that goal was subject to military waiting, and the frustration was proportional to the intensity of the hope that had sustained them through everything that had preceded it. The brownout period was, in the end, the war's final and most avoidable form of institutional waiting, and its mismanagement left a quiet but lasting mark on the relationship between the veteran community and the military establishment that took years, in some cases, to fully repair. Fact number 88. One of the most consistently overlooked dimensions of the soldier's waiting experience was its cumulative effect on personal identity. Men who entered military service in their late teens or early 20s, which described the majority of combatants, spent what would normally be the most identity-forming years of civilian life inside the institutional structure of the military. The waiting that filled most of that time was not neutral in its effects. It was waiting under uniform, under rank, under orders, in conditions that systematically subordinated individual preference and personality to collective requirement. When these men were eventually demobilized and asked to become civilians again, many discovered that the person who had entered the service and the person who emerged from it were not quite the same, and that the waiting, the long institutional middle of military life, had done as much of that reshaping as the combat had. Veterans who entered service at 18 and emerged at 22 or 23 had, in some real and meaningful sense, grown up in a waiting room. The identities they carried back into civilian life were identities formed in the interstitial time of military service, in the card games and the cold bivouacs and the letters home and the long nights on watch. And understanding those identities fully requires understanding not only what these men did during the war, but what they quietly and persistently endured during the very long hours when they were not doing very much at all. Fact number 89. The nurses who served in forward areas and field hospitals experienced a waiting that combined medical vigilance with personal vulnerability in a way that few other wartime roles required. American nurses in the Pacific, European, and Mediterranean theaters were closer to combat than any previous generation of military nurses had been, and their proximity to the front meant that the rhythm of their service alternated between periods of desperate activity during casualty surges and a waiting that was never fully relaxed, because the next surge could arrive at any moment without warning and demand everything immediately. Letters written by Army nurses during operational pauses describe an emotional state that is genuinely difficult to categorize. Not fear exactly, but a sustained and low-level readiness that prevented full rest and made the ordinary pleasures of downtime feel slightly unreal, slightly distant, as though enjoyed through glass. The nurses who served in field conditions also confronted the specific and lasting weight of witnessing serious injuries without the buffer of distance that combat soldiers had. When the fighting paused, the memory of the wounded remained, and the waiting between patient surges was filled, for many, with a private reckoning that no amount of professional training had quite prepared them for. Their experience of waiting was inseparable from the emotional labor of care, and its cost, measured in lasting psychological symptoms that persisted long after the war ended, was recognized even less promptly than the combat stress of the men they had treated with such patient, exhausted skill. Fact number 90. What the waiting of the Second World War ultimately reveals, when examined honestly and in full, is that the gap between ordinary life and extraordinary events is not dramatic or clean. It is long, gradual, and deeply recognizably human. The soldiers who fought the war spent most of their service in a state that was neither the heroism of combat nor the comfort of home, but a third condition, sustained, unremarkable endurance, that has no satisfying name and no monument built in its honor. They played cards, wrote letters, dug holes, listened to the radio, argued about food, and stared at the sky above landscapes they had never expected to see. They made friendships they would keep for the rest of their lives and lost others in moments so fast that memory could barely catch them. They endured institutional absurdity with humor, physical hardship with stoicism, and emotional isolation with whatever internal resources they could find or quietly improvise. This is not a lesser story than the story of battles won and ground taken. In many ways it is a harder story, because it is without the redemption of dramatic action, without the clarity of defined purpose, and without the consolation of a visible and immediate result. It is the story of what most of the war actually was. An immense collective effort to keep going, day after day, through circumstances that offered no guarantee and no exit, in the hope that the waiting would eventually, finally, be worth it. They held on, and that too was the war. Fact number 91. The food parcels that arrived from home, packed by mothers, wives, and sisters with items that could survive a long ocean crossing without refrigeration, became one of the most emotionally powerful objects of the entire war. The practical contents mattered, of course. Additional calories, familiar flavors, small luxuries unavailable through military supply channels. But the emotional content was even more significant than the nutritional one. A parcel packed at home required decisions: which biscuits, which tin, which small personal item to tuck in beside them. Each decision was an act of imaginative care, an attempt to reach across thousands of miles and provide something that military service simply could not. Soldiers who received such parcels described the experience in terms that went well beyond the pleasure of the food itself. The wrapping paper still carrying a faint domestic smell, the handwritten note folded carefully between two tins, the unmistakable evidence of someone's quiet, thoughtful attention on an ordinary afternoon far away. Sharing the contents with bunkmates was standard practice, and it served a social function beyond the obvious. The parcel became briefly communal, importing something of the domestic world into the institutional one, and giving a group of men for a short time the particular warmth of being fed by someone who cared. Military mail handlers, aware of the parcel's importance, treated them with unusual care. The humble care package was, in the quiet economy of wartime waiting, one of the most important instruments of human connection the war produced. Fact number 92. The historians who have studied the Second World War most closely tend, without exception, to note the distance between the public memory of the conflict and the private memory of those who actually lived through it. The public memory is populated with battles, commanders, turning points, and technology. The private memory, preserved in the letters, diaries, and oral histories that veterans and their families have donated to archives around the world, is populated with people, relationships, places, smells, and the long, specific textures of time that never made it into any official record. The waiting that fills so much of this private archive is not simply background to a story whose real content lies elsewhere. It is the content. The war was, for most of the people who participated in it, an experience of sustained and uncertain waiting. For orders, for news, for the chance to act, for the chance to rest, for the chance to finally go home. Understanding that waiting is essential to understanding the human reality of what the conflict demanded and what it cost. The facts gathered across this series have been an attempt to honor that reality, to look directly and with full attention at the unremarkable middle of the war, the long hours and empty days that shaped the people who lived through them as profoundly as any battle ever planned or any ground ever taken. The waiting was real, it mattered, and it cost something that has never been fully named or fully repaid. Fact number 93. The signals personnel who maintained communication networks during static periods performed a kind of waiting that was entirely technical and entirely essential, yet almost entirely invisible in historical accounts. Radio operators, telegraph clerks, and telephone linesmen worked in rotating shifts throughout the operational pauses, maintaining the information infrastructure that would be critical the moment the army moved again. Their work during quiet periods was defined by a particular kind of alert monotony. They had to remain ready to transmit or receive at any moment, while actually transmitting or receiving very little. Equipment had to be maintained, frequencies monitored, codes updated regularly, and lines checked. Not because anything was happening, but because the entire structure depended on its readiness for when something did. Veterans of signals units described their waiting as technical rather than simply temporal. Waiting that required active and continuous engagement with equipment and procedure, even in the complete absence of operational content to fill it. These men rarely appeared in the dramatic narratives of the war because their contribution was definitionally invisible when it was working correctly. The absence of communication failure was not a story that anyone thought to tell. Their patient, skilled, and unacknowledged waiting was the unglamorous scaffolding upon which every dramatic military operation of the war ultimately and entirely depended, the quiet structure underneath the noise, holding everything up without ever being seen. Fact number 94. The quartermaster units responsible for supplying armies in the field spent more time waiting than almost any other military element, and their waiting was defined by a particular and wearing combination of heavy responsibility and complete practical impotence. They knew what was needed. They knew where it was, or where it was supposed to be. The gap between those two pieces of knowledge, across a supply chain that could be interrupted by weather, enemy action, shipping delays, or simple administrative error, was the territory in which they spent their working days. Quartermasters in the Pacific described waiting for supply shipments in terms that combined professional anxiety with a physical helplessness that had no easy outlet. They could plan, anticipate, communicate urgently up and down the chain, and prepare receiving areas with meticulous care. They could not make the ships move faster. They could not improve the weather. They could not repair the railway line that had been cut the night before. When supplies finally arrived, the correct ammunition, the fresh rations, the medical equipment that had been urgently requested weeks earlier, the relief was disproportionate to the logistical event itself, because it represented the resolution of a waiting that had been simultaneously passive and intensely active in ways that left very little room for anything else. The quartermaster's contribution to the war's outcome was as significant as any general's, and it was made entirely in the unremarkable spaces of organizational waiting, earning correspondingly little recognition then or since. Fact number 95. The photographers and cinematographers who documented the war necessarily captured far more waiting than combat, simply because there was so much more waiting to capture. The archive of wartime visual documentation is full of soldiers at ease, sitting on vehicles, playing cards, eating, sleeping, reading letters, staring at nothing in particular with the specific expression of men whose minds are somewhere else entirely. These images are among the war's most honest documents, and they have been consistently underused in favor of the dramatic action footage that makes up a small fraction of the total visual record. The photographers who took these waiting images, Margaret Bourke-White, Robert Capa, Yevgeny Khalday, and thousands of lesser-known service photographers, were documenting something the military establishment did not always welcome being documented: the sheer scale of human time the war consumed in ways that were neither heroic nor useful for public morale. Some of this material was censored. Much of it sat in archives for decades without being widely reproduced or examined. When it finally began appearing in exhibitions and publications from the 1970s onward, it quietly changed the visual vocabulary available for understanding what the war had actually been. It shifted the dominant image away from the grammar of action and toward the grammar of endurance, which was, by any honest accounting of the time involved, the grammar the war had spoken most of the time to most of the people who lived through it. Fact number 96. The waiting of the Second World War did not end cleanly when the armistice documents were signed. For many veterans, the war's waiting continued in psychological form long after they had returned to civilian clothes and the quiet routines of domestic life. The hypervigilance carefully tuned during months of watchful idleness, the hair-trigger readiness for something to happen that had characterized the pre-combat waiting, did not simply switch off when the external conditions that had produced it were removed. Veterans described the civilian post-war world as paradoxically both too quiet and too unpredictable simultaneously, lacking the institutional structure that had organized their waiting for years, yet full of ordinary and random events that the nervous system, still calibrated for wartime, read as potential signals requiring attention. This psychological residue of wartime waiting was not recognized as a clinical condition until decades after the war, when research on post-traumatic stress began to account for the full range of wartime experience rather than focusing exclusively on acute combat exposure. The waiting had shaped the nervous system in ways that were durable and slow to resolve, and the return to peace was, for many veterans, itself a form of waiting, waiting for the inner war to quiet down, waiting for the body to stop listening so hard, waiting for ordinary life to feel ordinary again. For some men, it eventually did. For others, it never entirely did, and for all of them, the waiting had left its mark in ways that peace alone could not simply undo. Fact number 97. There was one form of waiting during the Second World War unique to its historical moment, the atomic waiting that followed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. In the days and weeks after the bombings, soldiers, civilians, and governments around the world found themselves in a new and entirely unprecedented suspension, waiting to understand what had happened, what it truly meant, and what kind of world had just quietly and irrevocably begun. For American troops in the Pacific who had been preparing for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, the atomic end of the war produced an immediate and overwhelming relief that was genuine and completely unambiguous. They had been told the invasion would cost hundreds of thousands of casualties. The news that it would not happen was received as a personal reprieve of the most profound kind. For everyone else, the citizens of defeated nations, the occupied populations of Asia, the Allied soldiers in Europe already through their own victory, the atomic waiting had a different and more unsettled quality, a dawning awareness that the world had changed in ways that would take a generation, perhaps more, to fully absorb and understand. This waiting, suspended between the definitive end of one era and the deeply uncertain beginning of another, was perhaps the war's final and most historically significant form of collective endurance. The whole world, in those weeks, was waiting together, waiting to find out what kind of place it had become. Fact number 98. The military theorists who studied the Second World War in the decades after it ended arrived, independently and through different methodologies, at a similar and important conclusion: that the capacity of military forces to endure waiting productively was as operationally significant as their capacity for sustained combat. Armies that had maintained discipline, cohesion, and psychological health during the long operational pauses between major engagements consistently outperformed, at the moment of actual commitment, armies that had allowed morale to quietly erode during the idle periods preceding it. This finding, replicated across study after study, shifted military thinking about the management of inactive time from a welfare consideration to a strategic one. Modern military organizations invest substantially in the management of deployment waiting, recreational facilities, reliable communication access, mental health support, and purposeful training programs, precisely because the research demonstrated clearly that the quality of waiting is not peripheral to military effectiveness. It is central to it. The soldiers of the Second World War demonstrated this truth at enormous human cost across 6 years of service in every corner of the world. The lesson their experience purchased was eventually, imperfectly, and with considerable delay, institutionalized in the organizations that followed them, but the learning required living through it first, and the men who did the living paid for the lesson in years of their lives, in patience and boredom and cold and longing and the daily, unacknowledged labor of simply continuing to show up, that no monument has yet found adequate words to honor. Fact number 99. The children born to veterans in the years immediately after the war, the leading edge of what became known as the baby boom, grew up in households shaped, in ways rarely articulated and rarely examined, by the waiting their parents had done. The veterans who returned and built homes and started families brought with them a specific emotional inheritance, a profound and deeply personal appreciation for stability, predictability, and the ordinary domestic pleasures that military waiting had made almost unbearably precious. The post-war decade's cultural emphasis on home, family, consumer goods, and settled routine was not simply a product of economic prosperity or deliberate social policy. It was, in significant part, a response to years of deprivation and suspension. Men and women who had spent years waiting to come home made homes with a particular intentionality, furnished them, maintained them, and defended their ordinariness against any suggestion that ordinary was insufficient. The suburban culture that historians sometimes describe as conformist or quietly repressive was, from the inside, something else entirely. It was the deliberate creation by a generation that had been denied it for years, of the stable and comfortable life they had rehearsed in imagination through thousands of hours of military waiting. Understanding the post-war world requires understanding the waiting that preceded it. The world that veterans built was, in a very real and human sense, the world they had been imagining during the long, patient, difficult years of waiting, finally at last made real. Fact number 100. Across all the theaters, all the armies, and all the cultures that participated in the Second World War, one form of waiting was completely universal. The waiting that happened in the moment just before sleep, when the day's activity had ended and the night's unconsciousness had not yet arrived. This was the time when institutional control relaxed its hold, when the collective rhythms of military life gave way briefly to the individual interior, and when each man was alone with his own thoughts in the particular way that darkness and stillness and the absence of demands make possible. What happened in those minutes was not recorded and cannot be fully recovered, but the letters soldiers wrote the next morning, the diary entries that began with "last night I was thinking about," and the oral histories that circle back repeatedly to the quiet before sleep, suggest that this daily threshold was among the war's most important psychological spaces. It was where fears were confronted without witnesses, where homesickness was felt without the need to manage how it appeared, where the meaning of the entire enterprise, what was being defended, what was being risked, whether it was genuinely worth the cost, was privately and honestly examined by the person most qualified to examine it. The waiting before sleep was the war's most intimate form. The world it produced in individual minds was as varied, as honest, and as humanly significant as anything that happened in full daylight, in any theater, on any day the histories chose to record. Fact number 101. The last fact in this series is perhaps the simplest and the hardest. Most of the people who lived through the Second World War are gone now, and with them has gone the living memory of what the waiting actually felt like. Not what it consisted of historically, but what it was like to be inside it, hour by hour, in a body that was tired, and a mind that was uncertain, and a heart that was pointing steadily and persistently toward home. What remains are the documents, the letters, the diaries, the photographs of men looking at nothing in particular, and the people who carry an inheritance they may only half understand. History tends to remember wars by their decisive moments, their battles and commanders and turning points, because those are the things that changed the shape of the world. But the people who made history's decisive moments possible spent most of their time in the unremarkable in-between, in the patient, costly, quietly determined work of simply continuing to show up. They waited for orders and for letters and for the war to end and for something to make sense of what they were going through. Some of them found that sense. Some of them never quite did. All of them waited, and the world they were waiting to protect, the world we have inherited and live in now, was built at least as much on that waiting as on anything that happened when the shooting finally started. It was built on patience, on endurance, on the daily, unwitnessed, uncelebrated decision to keep going. That too was the war. That in many ways was the heart of it. There is a version of the Second World War that most people know. It is populated with generals and invasions, with famous beaches and burning cities, with dates that get memorized and monuments that governments build. It is a story structured around action, the decision made, the assault launched, the battle won or lost. It has been told and retold in books and films and ceremonies for the better part of a century now, and it is not wrong. The events it describes were real. The courage they required was genuine and extraordinary. But that is not the whole story. It is not even, by any honest measure of time, most of the story. Most of the story was quiet. It was the sound of cards being shuffled in a tent in North Africa, the scratch of a pen across a letter in the Pacific, the creak of a troopship somewhere in the middle of an ocean that felt as though it would never end. It was a man lying awake in a barracks in England, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember exactly what his wife's voice sounded like. It was a woman at a machine in a country house in Buckinghamshire, watching a drum turn slowly and waiting for a signal that might mean everything. It was a teenager in a foxhole in France, quietly doing arithmetic in his head to work out how many days it had been since he last had a proper meal. They brought those marks home with them. The world they built after the war, the homes and the families and the careers and the quiet routines, was built by people who had been shaped by waiting, and who carried in them a specific and earned appreciation for the ordinary that came directly from having been denied it for so long. When veterans talked about peace, they were not speaking abstractly or politically. They were talking about something they had practiced, in imagination, through thousands of hours of military waiting, until it had become the most vivid and the most precious thing in their minds. We owe them the full story, Not just the battles, not just the heroes, not just the dates and the turning points, but the long and unremarkable and deeply human middle of the war. The part that history tends to move quickly past because it resists the grammar of drama. The man waiting for a letter, the woman waiting for an intercept, the teenager waiting for an order, the family waiting for the telegram that would either relieve them or quietly, permanently destroy them. History is not only what people did, it is also what they endured, and the endurance of ordinary waiting, patient, unglamorous, privately costly, and almost entirely unrecorded, is as much a part of what won this war as any campaign ever planned in any headquarters anywhere. The world these people waited to protect still stands. It still holds their letters in its archives. It still carries their waiting in its bones, though it has largely forgotten where that particular weight came from and what it cost to put it there. The least we can do, at this distance, is to remember, not just that they fought, but that they waited, that the waiting was real, that it mattered deeply, and that it cost them something we have never fully named and never fully repaid. They held on, through the boredom and the cold and the fear and the longing and the absurdity and the quiet grief of not yet home. Through all of it, they held on. That too was the war. That, perhaps, was the very heart of it. Sleep well,